You don't understand that we are the line of defense because you want to get rid of us.
I think you're saying liberals. Liberals need to understand.
No, I'm saying specifically Mormons. Like, our specific brand of Christianity in Utah is a great one because when you're raised,
I'm thinking of
here,
the church more at large. I don't care. Honestly, Utah at this point is a cluster bomb of intellectually dishonest anti-Mormons and then cultural Mormons that are too many generations removed from the sacrifice of their forefathers that they think church is about singing primary songs. Like, I have no respect for these people.
I mean, but the reality is,
oh, you do not realize what kind of a can of whoop-ass you have opened. Carden Ellis, I am calling you out. You have no idea what kind of pain you are going to suffer. And Quaker, you want to talk about snapping into a Slim Jim? I've never seen a slimmer Jim what I'm going to snap into with you. I will come after your children. I will come after your children's children. I will come after multiple generations of you and smack you down.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Talk on Things and Stuff, where I am joined by Yu-Gi-Oh! And we're going to talk a little bit today under the heading of something called punching up and smacking down. Now, if you've paid attention to the dialogue and discourse that goes along between anti-Mormons, ex-Mormons, and Mormons and apologists, you can see that this back and forth that we get a lot of somebody making a video, making an article, and then the response to that article becomes very important. And I've done it myself. And you can kind of look through the YouTube channel and see examples of that. And a lot of the times you can focus on your exact arguments, the way that you're going to prove that this person said such and such that is wrong, or the way that they just don't understand the reality that you understand. And in the course of focusing on the structure and the nuts and bolts of your argument, sometimes you can lose sight of the fact that we are people with lives and relationships. And many times the people that you're arguing with are the very people that you love and the very people that you want to connect with and the very people that you want to have a relationship with. And the way that you go about doing your argument affects the nature of those relationships. And it also affects how convincing or compelling you can state your case. But on the other side of things is that those of us that have left the church went through a period of our lives where the things that we thought were unquestionably true turned out not to be, as we learned and explored more. And that phenomenon of thinking that something is true and unquestioned, and then discovering that it actually isn't as certain or true as you thought, is not something that ends when you leave the church. It's actually an ongoing, lifelong process if you want to continue to try to have your decisions be guided by truth. And so that is going to be the subject of today's discussion, which is kind of the framework of, should we be doing smackdowns, or how should we frame our discussion? It's one thing to have a discussion with an anonymous person online, which can be somewhat performative because you're trying to make points that other people who are onlookers can have. And so you may not even care how vicious and cruel you are to your ideological opponent, but also how you have those conversations with your family and loved one. And this was brought to my attention, in particular, a video recently published by the Midnight Mormons, because it included some very pointed criticism of the ex-Mormon community at large. And I thought it would be a great exercise to go through, how we actually do that. So I want to go ahead and see if I can bring that link up. And I'm going to introduce you to the gentleman that brought this to my attention. He's somebody that was apparently part of the ex-Mormon community before I ever entered the scene, and he's kind of laid low for a while, but I've had some excellent conversations with him. I encounter people who, even in the ex-Mormon world, will see things a little bit differently than maybe the wider ex-Mormon narrative, if there is one. And so I've really valued a lot of our conversations, and that is Chris Hanna. So Chris, how are you doing today?
Great. After that intro, that was hilarious. I was cracking up. I'm such a fan of Randy Savage and Smackdowns, and
I know it's terrible that we're gonna try to deconstruct and reconstruct the Smackdown as something that's perhaps a little healthier. Yeah. But I was so fascinated when you brought this video to my attention, because they say a lot of things that are really hard to approach in this environment after Elder Holland's given his talk. We live in a world where everybody's like, words are violence. And if his words are bad and mean or could lead people to think a certain way, it's just going to do all these different things. And a lot of those subjects are discussed in this conversation. But what was it that first, why are you watching these guys in the first place? These Midnight Mormons?
Well, I mean, maybe it was kind of accidental. I can't say I'm any sort of expert on them. I don't watch them all the time. I've watched several videos. I followed them. I mean, I think everybody might know them a little bit for some recent drama that happened with them. But
yeah.
Just poking around, whenever some sort of issue comes up, it's long been my standard way of doing things to poke around and look at every side of it. Really, every side of it. A lot of people say they look at every side of it. They don't. And it's been that way with a million different issues. Something comes up and I check as many sides as I can about it. And I've kind of held that stance for.
Do you even do that though years. on the church issues? Like, as ex-Mormons, we already know everything there is to know about the church. Why do we need to, what other side do we need to look at?
Well,
how do you address that?
One of the things that's been blowing my mind is that I didn't know that these certain arguments existed on the apologist side, especially recently. I'd say, as you said, I've been around this for a long, long time. Just to throw in some of my credibility, I was probably there live at most of the old Mormon Expression videos. I didn't ever go on the scene. I was invited on once, but I'd usually kind of say no, because if I wasn't the expert on the book, I didn't want to be on there commenting. But I kind of got a little bored with the ex-Mormon scene for a while and didn't pay attention for a while. And I was more into what most of us were, the more at large kind of world culture war going on type stuff. And only really circled back a couple months ago. I'd always kind of keep my ear to the ground, a little bit of stuff. But I've been kind of more blown away that the apologist side has advanced in certain ways, some of them good, some of them bad, and it's so they're morphing in ways, and you have to acknowledge that they're morphing, and it might morph in ways that your arguments get a little bit watered down against them if things get altered.
Yeah, if you're not paying attention to the way that they're framing arguments and some of the assumptions that they bring to the table, things that may even undermine past positions that apologists have held. But just like I think any of us don't like to be lumped in and generalized and our positions, our arguments, and our ideas assumed to be something just because people have said, oh, you're an apologist, or oh, you're an anti-Mormon. I think it's charitable to extend that same respect to people who may be defending the church, is that they don't all think the same, and they may approach things from a very different background. I want to move a little bit before we dive into these videos to talking specifically kind of about a set of rules for how to engage in these discussions. And a lot of times we get in kind of a tit for tat sort of thing where it's like, well, if you're going to disprove a point of me, I'm going to listen to what you say just so I can get a gotcha. And then I'm not really listening to the rest of you. I'm just waiting for you to stop flapping your lips so that I can tell you my gotcha moment. And it's really not that productive. And in many cases, it ends up just escalating the resentment and the animosity that you feel towards your interlocutor, and can kind of just blow up conversations. So a lot of people have struggled with, how do you do that? Is there a way that we can avoid some of these pitfalls that we fall into, specifically things like creating straw man arguments? As much of, all of us that have, we've studied our logical fallacies, we know all about straw man, and we're just waiting to throw that in the face of somebody. But in the midst of it, we can fall into that ourselves, where we are ourselves creating a caricature of an argument and assuming that that's what our opponent has. So somebody came up with a set of rules that I knew they were vaguely out there, but you introduced the name of them to me, and that is Rapoport's rules. Where did you first encounter Rapoport's rules?
They were in a book by James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian about how to have impossible conversations. Although I think it was first popularized by Daniel Dennett. A lot of people might know Daniel Dennett. I was an old school card carrying follower of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse back when that kind of the anti-theist Christopher Hitchens movement was going down, and I was a big fan of Christopher Hitchens, especially, and Daniel Dennett was the one who went into it. And Daniel Dennett, over the years, has really, really gained my respect in a lot of ways because he is very good at moral psychology concepts, moral philosophy. He's a philosopher, and a lot of people like Sam Harris are kind of bad at it. They get really bad at understanding the concept that there's a gap between what is and what ought to be in philosophy. And I'm getting off track a little bit, but Harris's whole entire book about the moral landscape was him kind of trying to bridge that gap. Dennett himself came out and criticized that hard, so they even kind of started having their own mix-ups there. But Daniel Dennett was the one who really, really got into the Rapoport's rules, and Rapoport was a person that Dennett had studied with his kind of extreme philosopher level, who was a game theorist. And
okay. Well, I want to bring up those rules, and it's funny that this is happening in the context where you mentioned Hitchens, because Hitchens became very famous for the hitch slap, which you would watch a video clip of him just totally deconstructing, refuting, and just doing it with such force and power that it's like, how could anyone withstand the strength of his argument?
I grew up I grew up watching the WWE, like I did watch Randy Savage and those guys, but then somewhere in like my mid 20s watching Hitch do that was my new WWE. I used to love it.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's see. I want to bring them up here. So this is Rapoport's rules. Now, there are 4 rules, and these are the rules as they were originally stated. Now, as you mentioned, Anatole Rapoport was a mathematician. He was a bit of a polymath and knew a lot of different things, but he ended up getting involved in game theory. His most famous contribution is a very brief solution to the prisoner's dilemma that served as a very kind of a logic bomb of altruism. But these 4 rules are where we're going to start from. Now, the first one is that you should attempt to re-express your target's position so clearly, vividly, and fairly that even your target is able to say, thanks, I wish I thought of putting it that way. And we're going to go over these a little bit more in detail in a moment. Second, he said you should list any points of agreement, especially if they are not matters of general or widespread agreement that you have with the position of the person you're speaking with. Third, you should then mention anything you have learned from your target or from the person you're speaking with. And finally, and only after you've gone through those first 3 steps, are you permitted to say even a single word of rebuttal or criticism? Now, this is kind of like a set of rules in a game theory scenario that are set up to facilitate a conversation that is not really meant at debate where there is a winner, but in dialogue where there is mutual respect in a common pursuit of truth. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, game theory is probably a little bit more mathematical, and he was a mathematical thinker, but it is somewhat kind of like the dialectic, to use that Kantian dialectic over a Hegelian.
So there were a lot of words in that definition, and what I wanted to do to try to distill it down to something that I could put up as a little icon to remind us as we go through here when we respond to this video to try to apply this. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a weird way to go about criticizing or responding to something that the Midnight Mormons have done, but it's going to be where we take those 4 steps, and I've distilled them into something that includes alliteration, because Mormons and ex-Mormons love alliteration. So the first one is to restate responsibly. Okay. Now, what I mean by restate responsibly is your first step in responding to somebody that you're having a dialogue with is going to be to repeat back to them what they've told you in your own words. So you're not simply using the same words, but you're conveying that not only have you listened, but you understand. And even if you, and I think this is even better if you can add a little bit more depth that's informed by your own experience. This is unique for us as ex-Mormons because many of us will be able to relate to the position of someone defending the church. And what you're doing by restating it is that you're conveying that you care enough to listen. You're extending charity. Now, this is one of the most important aspects of this entire conversation is charity. And that is that people are going to be saying things that could be taken any number of ways. You could interpret something that somebody says, perhaps an ill-chosen metaphor, and you could interpret it in the worst possible light, saying that he's doing something, he's intentionally using that word to convey beneath the surface some sort of nefarious thing. And that's an uncharitable interpretation of it. Or you could extend charity to the person that you're dialoguing with and try to take the best interpretation of what they do. Now, this is where this golden rule is helpful, because when I'm talking to someone, I want them to extend charity to the words that I use and the arguments that I make. I want them to understand that I'm not trying to hurt or to cause ill will. And so if they can interpret what I say, if they have a choice of interpreting it uncharitably or interpreting it charitably, I want them to interpret charitably. And so I expect them to do that. And I want to extend that to them because there's a degree of reciprocity in this way of speaking. So what that's also going to do is it's going to avoid straw man arguments, because you're restating to them in your own words with your own understanding and giving them a chance to say, yeah, I agree. And he includes the idea that your person you're talking with is responding, because you want to pause and give, you can start out by saying, well, from what I hear you saying is, and then restate it and then just say, is that right? And then they'll be able to either clarify or validate that you understand it correctly. Is there anything that you would add to this first step of Rapoport's rules?
I think you said it. I mean, exactly right. I just think about how much that's been a minefield in the social media world nowadays. That's already where most stuff fails, is right there. And I've even come across the situation where if you even try to be the person who, you're not the one who's holding the position, you're trying to explain someone else's position to somebody else, and you get it just blows up in your face. And I don't even hold that position. I'm telling you what their actual position is. And
but you've triggered the reflex just by defending it.
Yep.
Even if it's not yours.
Mm-hmm.
And this can be really challenging. It can be really hard when we live in an era where people are really quick to say that words are violence. So suddenly whenever you say words are violence, then it automatically sets you up to immediately interpret anything that is said in the worst possible light, and then to assign motive to it and say, this is what you meant to say. And there are even people out there who take this idea that comes from art criticism and art literature called the death of the author, where they say, it doesn't really matter what you intended. The only thing that matters is what actually happens. And so if I could interpret something that you say as being ill-intended or going to have ill effects, I'm going to assume that I'm going to act and respond as though that's the worst possible outcome is what you did. It doesn't matter what you intended. And that sounds good when you're on the side of being able to point the finger and say, you did this, you look at all the harm that you're doing. But when you find yourself on the other end of that, and when you find that things that you were doing in good faith to try to make a point or try to share your perspective are being taken as though they are specifically intended and designed to hurt people, it feels less soft and fuzzy.
Yeah, for sure. And then it becomes just kind of a typical point where you can easily just now start, if we're gonna play that game, we can all just start pointing out where you failed at that.
Yeah, exactly. And all of these different aspects where the conversation gets derailed into these side paths, this is where an actual exchange of ideas and an actual dialogue break down and descend into the social media infighting. And so it's kind of by focusing on these rules, remembering not to get sidetracked with all of the squibbling that characterizes these ways, is really the way to connect with the person that you're connecting with and open up the dialogue to pursue truth, not to gain a victory. And that distinction is, you're not trying to gain a victory, you're trying to get understanding. And you don't need to win, you just need to come away from the discussion having some thoughtful things to consider yourself. And if you've modeled this appropriately, the other person will feel like they can do the same thing without having to see you as an enemy. And that's where we get to part number 2, which is acknowledge agreements. Now, in addition to wanting to avoid strawman arguments, we also want to avoid something called the what's it called? It's called the kickback effect, or the word is totally escaping me. Where you
to double down.
Yeah, well, it's like where you're having a discussion and people, because they interpret your criticism as an attack on them directly, then they feel more compelled to double down on their position without actually considering your perspective, because it's tied into their identity. And
yeah, it's that old. Many people probably seen it. That oatmeal. The oatmeal did like a long kind of comic strip on it, and people pass it around about how aggressively disagree and will just make people double down on it. Yeah, so I've heard it described as the double down effect, or the kickback effect, or something like that. I know that there's another term also. I know. Yeah. What you're trying to put your finger on, I'm trying to too. But
yeah, I had it bookmarked here, but I think I deleted my. Oh yeah, it's the backfire effect. Okay, there we go.
There you go.
Okay. Okay, so what is it about acknowledging agreements? Now, this is where you're going to take the position that has been given to you by the person you're dialoguing with, and you're going to consider what they have to say. And even if this person just makes you want to barf, wants to throw up, if they really get your goat, but you're trying to actually connect with them and trying to have a discussion with them, then take all the things that really upset you about them and just put them to the side and just say, the rule of the game is that I find something I agree with. Even if it's just like, hey, you're wearing a blue shirt, I like blue, or whatever it is, just find something that you can agree with them because you want to connect with them. And what you're doing here is doing your side of this type of reciprocity, where you want them to see you, and so you need to see them. And acknowledging agreements is the first step on finding some thread upon which you can find someone to be in your tribe. You know, even if it's like, if you meet somebody and they like the same sports team that you do, even if, you know, you would disagree with them on any other thing, that connection gives you some common ground to start with. And so by acknowledging agreements, you're telling the person you're speaking with that I see you, I respect you, I see some of me in you. And that is going to form a basis for mutual respect that we will continue to have when we continue this discussion. And it helps inform the person you're speaking with that you don't think that they're simply nincompoops, you don't think that they're idiots. You know, there's something to this discussion that they are then able to learn from. Do you have anything to add to that?
On that one, not exactly. The only thing I'd add to what we've said so far is that, and it will apply to all 4 of these, but social media seems almost kind of perfectly designed to make these things fail and make it impossible to do, and make it, you know, things turn into flame wars and turn into worse. And I have failed at it as much as anybody has, and it's always kind of like, at some point you have to step back and say, I got to try again and do better this time. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm getting calls in the middle of this, and so I'm trying to
no problem at all.
Address that. On the subject of how, you know, I'm up on a soapbox talking about all this stuff, but I absolutely am not perfect about it. And I've had my own failures with this as well. So
sometimes decidedly so. Here. Sometimes I know, it's time to just blow this up and I just go off. And but the goal is to always try to restart.
All right. Yeah. Okay, sorry for that aside. I think everything's taken care of. So let's go now to list lessons learned. So acknowledge agreements. You're finding something in you common with the person that you're speaking with. You're identifying them at the same level. List lesson learns is where you're really kind of questioning yourself and trying to identify something from their perspective that they have given you. And there's something if you're willing to learn a lesson, whether it's that you learn that something that you believed was wrong, or some degree of ignorance that you had on a subject, they have now filled in with additional information. What you're modeling is that you're willing to listen and actually accept things that change your perspective. That's important because you would like your ideas and your arguments to change the person in a reciprocal way. And this is very important because it helps us to see through our own biases and our own assumptions, because you kind of have to set aside all of the walls and all of the shields and defenses that you have in order to put yourself in that position. Do you see what I mean?
Yep. I would say, I mean, maybe they'll come up when we go over things, but just ever since Holland's talk, it's the way I kind of am. I mean, I'm in the gym a lot, you know, or I at my work, I can have earphones in my ear. So I have a chance to get to hear a lot of different sides because I kind of do it to get entertained. Since the Holland talk, my focus has been on that thing. I've heard so many different sides. I've had 20 different lessons learned since the Holland talk, like on both sides. Like I never would have thought they would have thought that. I never thought they would have thought that. And that's how it should be, I guess. I mean, it's actually kind of a fun time when you learn those things, I think.
Yeah. And it's funny because I know I've been in discussions where I can feel it's like a sense of internal indignation that you feel when you feel like they're not listening to me, they're not taking my points. I cannot lead them. I can't let them believe or see that I have any degree of uncertainty about my position. So I can't accept that I've learned anything from them, because then they're going to think my position is weak. And so there's almost like this internal psychological pushback against this principle of acknowledging and listing lessons that you've learned from the person you're having a dialogue with. And it's okay to like acknowledge that that's an impulse. And I think it's a very natural impulse that we all have anytime we're in this type of discussion, and try to push through and work through it and just say, no. If I'm going to be respected and listened to, I need to actually do that to this person. I need to set those kind of low-level internal id-based feelings aside and see what I can do to connect to the person. So that's the only caveat there, is it's going to be hard to do it.
I would list one other caveat, is that sometimes in the process of people not understanding each other, if you accept part of their position, they might not understand the nuance of just the small part of it. You accept, they might think that you accepted the whole part, the whole chunk. You know?
Right. And that's something that as you practice this skill, practice responding by going through these different phases, you'll learn that there are more effective ways to do it. And the thing that you just brought up, where you want to agree with them on one thing, that there's something that distinguishes it completely, perhaps even from where they stand, is the but versus the and. So many times you'll say, okay, yeah, I listen to you. I agree with this, but, and each of us has a circuit in our head, which is that as soon as the but comes out, you just invalidate any other degree of agreement, because now they're going to go into there. And just try it. Like anytime you're about to say but, instead of saying but, just say and then complete your sentence. You don't have to change anything else. Because if you say something that contradicts something else that's said, it's going to stand in place of what else, that it may contradict. And you didn't trigger that psychological but circuit of, immediately shutting down your opponent because they heard the word but. And
I just learned something on the lessons learned part. That's a good concept. Yeah.
Okay, so then finally, and he very specifically put the respond step as the very last step, because it is only after you've been able to convey to the person you're speaking with that you understand where they're coming from, you understand their position, you've learned from them, and that you connected at that level. That's the only point at which they may even care about what you're going to respond with. And when I say respectfully respond, that's because it can be very easy to descend into name calling, to make broad generalizations about the person that you're speaking with, to make assumptions. And we all try to short circuit these conversations by skipping over the part that would need to validate some of those assumptions and just making an argument that you think that they're making without having validating it beforehand, and all conversations. So let's see here. Anything that you would add to respectfully respond? That's where we're trying to avoid ad hominem and insert our points of disagreement.
There's been many times since I've been around this for so many years, as other people have been, and there was a time frame where I spent more of my arguing time against Mormons, and then there was a time frame where I argued with ex-Mormons. But in any sort of situation where it devolves into where somebody's calling names, there's a bit of a situation where you know that if you don't call a name and the other person just starts calling names in a weird way, that to an outside looker, that looks like the person calling the names is the
I may have jumped the gun on your. Was that the point you were going to make, or were you going to make the point that you?
You said it just right.
Okay. Well, there's two sides to that, because I think in some cases people say, "Oh, he's weak; he can't respond in kind." But then there's another way of interpreting that is, and the kind of the way I see it is that as soon as I am observing a debate and somebody goes to ad hominem, I immediately think that the person that went to ad hominem has lost, because rather than argue the point, they've attacked the individual or the person. But I think those are two, sides of why it's not good to go there either way.
Absolutely. And that's one area I've done pretty well in my life over, especially when somebody starts really kind of like starting to call me names. But then they'll also, maybe people might consider something a name, like, if I said, well, you're being a bit of a hack or something like that, but that could be like a name or something like that. But yeah, I avoid getting I've always been pretty good at avoiding calling anybody anything terrible or pointing out their appearances or anything like that.
Okay, so I think we're now about 30 minutes into it, and that's kind of about as much time as I wanted to spend really going through this concept of Rapoport's rules. This is something that I was really surprised that if you Google Rapoport's rules on YouTube, you really can't find any nice, brief videos describing this, and it is such a gem of wisdom in how we can improve the way that we interact with people online, interact with our loved ones. So I wanted to make sure that we had this.
It's hard too, because there's another Rapoport rule. There's
it's like in geology or something.
No, it's in biology. It's the rule that there's more life around the equator. That's called Rapoport's rule.
Oh, yep. Yeah, that is not the rule that we're talking about here. Okay, so let's see. With that being said, let me see if I can. So the video that we are specifically responding to is going to be a video that's not originally appearing on the Midnight Mormons channel. It was actually a video that appeared on a different YouTube channel called Last Dispensation, and they shared it on their channel first, and then it showed up on Midnight Mormons just a day ago or so. And what I've done is I've gone and I've broke it down into chunks in chronological format where they address a particular issue. And I think it starts off a little bit not relevant to the topic, but then it gets very relevant. So let's start. And I'm going to keep this little overlay on the screen to kind of remind us as we go through it that we want to try to apply this principle as we're listening to what they say. So I'll add this to our stream, and we will get started here. This is the host of Last Dispensation. He's really just hosting a conversation that's primarily between the Midnight Mormon people.
It's like when you figured out your parents had sex for the first time and you're like, no! I mean, come on. Yes. Okay. Yes.
Okay. That was in the middle of it. All right. Hold on. That's a preview.
That was one of the interesting
points. I have a couple thoughts about this.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Well, let's wait till we get to it, and then I want to hear your thoughts on it. Okay.
I have a couple thoughts about this, and my first thought is, one, we perhaps seminary teachers and church correlation have a little bit of fault here, because I don't think we've taught the doctrine of sealing very well. When we decided to try to be like all the other Christian churches, we took away the uniqueness of what we really believe, and we've kind of dumbed it down to sealing is just a temple wedding. And if you're just taught that sealing is just a temple wedding, and Bill and Bob want to get sealed in the temple, and you say, no, sorry, you're one of those gays, it can seem a little mean. But when you explain it the way Orson Pratt did in the early prophets, that we believe God is a human being The soul is the spirit and the body together, and your eternal existence is very physical and very spiritual, 50-50. So when you are sealed to somebody, that sealing process enables you to become a god, and godhood is the union of two. And you in that godhood have to create spirit children, and that is also a physical act. People get uncomfortable. It's like when you figured out your parents had sex for the first time and you're like, no, I mean, come on. Yes, okay, yes, there's sex in heaven. Hate to break it to you. We believe it, okay? Actually, I don't hate to break. I've waited this long, okay? There better be, all right? That's all I'm gonna say. So if we believe that and we say, look, we believe the sealing ceremony is specifically about creating gods. And in what Joseph Smith restored in the Mormon movement, godhood exists in the marriage of a man and a woman, specifically so they can physically create souls, which is a spirit and body together, and there's a biological reality to the continuation of godhood. And since two men biologically cannot create children, we cannot seal them in the temple, because if we did, how cruel would that be? If we put them in the sealing ceremony, seal them together, and then in the next life they say, "Oh, well, will I be able to? Now I'm a part of the godhood," and they say, "There's still you can't create spirit children. There's still the biological reality to godhood that Joseph Smith emphasized and that the early prophets emphasized." So we view God differently than other Christians. And since we haven't made that explicitly clear, and we haven't made the sealing ceremony explicitly clear that there is a biological reality to it, all it's doing is hurting people's feelings. So I think this goes way back when to one generation, I'm not going to name who, the Oomers, who decided, let's be like other Christians. Let's not be clear with what we believe. Let's add confusion. And now you've got gay members of the church wondering why they can't be married because we haven't told them what the dang ceremony truly is, because we don't want to be seen as weird.
All right. I wanted to let him make his full argument. Sometimes it's tempting to go in and just gotcha every little statement, and we'll have to break some of these up. But how would you restate his position here? The discussion is about the idea that there are gay people who have been hurt by the restriction that the church has on marriage for homosexuals. And so this is Kwaku trying to give a perspective about why the church itself may be at fault for people being hurt or feeling hurt. What do you think? Like, if you were going to encapsulate his argument, what would it be if you want to restate it?
I mean, it's been one of the interesting things for me over the years of figuring out how other Christians think, and I'm no super expert in all of it. I poke around, but it's been interesting to find out how much more in other Christian religions, it's more the spiritual, symbolic realm. And Mormonism really is one of the most materialist Christian religions. It's happening in this realm. It's happening with these bodies in this reality. Mm-hmm. And he kind of states that, he says it's 50-50, but I mean, the way that, even heaven's almost kind of like a place that exists in the universe near Kolob and all that sorts of stuff. There's a reality in Mormonism. Mormonism tries to really marry our physical body reality to the celestial world. And so his ultimate point is maybe kind of a funny one, is that there's probably like celestial gametes, and there's a it's all happening in the material realm, and their theology, the theology of Mormonism, is based that there's reality or physical actual limits into reality, into what can happen when creation happens. And maybe somebody in a more spiritual level religion that thinks that it's kind of a different realm when you go there, if you die and you're married to a spouse in that spiritual realm, maybe you could continue to procreate. Not that other Christian religions even keep thinking that, but it's part of the Mormon theology. It is part of the Mormon theology that it's based on a continuing, growing family in the material. I don't know if they would agree.
So I agree. I think what Kwaku's saying here is that Mormonism has a body of knowledge about the true nature of man and God, and that body of knowledge includes very specific and concrete things about gender. that are tied into the process of godhood, which is at the center of Mormonism as our purpose in life. And it is tied to our happiness and fulfilling our eternal purpose. And that is so central to Mormonism that if you take it away or become wishy-washy about it, it's no longer Mormonism. And because those truths are at the center of Mormonism, then the things which contribute to that, including the sealing ceremony, are inherent to it. They are one and it's all part of the same whole. And so this is where he's critical, not so much of ex-Mormons, he's critical of the leaders of the church, who he identifies as boomers, as not being true to this unique, special character of Mormon theology, and allowing there to be gray area that then removes this principle in the minds of people so that they could understand, oh, I can't have kids, and that's the purpose of godhood. And so the sealing is towards that end, towards the godhood, and it's not towards, legal rights on earth. And so it's like you can't force two incompatible genetic beings to create a new life and because Mormonism says that we're all gods in embryo, we're all of these things, you can't make it compatible. And so if the church would just do better at saying this is a sealing ceremony, it deals with godhood and exaltation, does not deal with marriage here on earth. So, you can be upset, and unfortunately you have to take it up with God that if you're gay, you can't have the access to those blessings, but don't tie it to marriage. And so I think from the perspective of a Mormon who accepts before all else that all of these things are true, it would make sense. This argument makes sense because it depends on the reality of the church that you believe in. So if you come across a Mormon thinking this, just realize this is the nature of their theology. It is who they are, and so they're expressing it.
There's some sense to it too. It's not like it's completely nonsensical. You have to step back and say there's a sensible concept behind that and it is kind of strange because even Mormon gods are subject to science,
Yeah. When you said that it's a very materialist world, I mean, that's exactly it. God does have to kind of follow the rules of physics in the realm of Mormonism. He's the God of the sphere, but that it includes laws that he has to comply with.
Yeah, I thought how sad would it be for those gods who got married as in the temple properly and are now two male gods married to each other. They get sad because they find out they can't continue to procreate as two male gods married together. I mean, and that might sound like I'm at the respectfully respond. I'm actually at the point of just trying to restate that their concept is those two male gods. Maybe we could seal them together, but they would not be able to procreate, even celestially.
Yeah, and that's where in thinking about this Rapoport's rules things, we're talking about two different realities. The people who believe that humans are gods in embryo, like that shapes their entire worldview, and it's tied with their identity because they place themselves in that system that they accept. And if you're confronting that in a debate/discussion, then it's kind of like, how do you have agreements with a reality that you don't find or identify or locate yourself in? How do you tackle that one? Because that's hard, because I see that happening here. I can't really find myself agreeing with any aspect of this theology because I don't hold the theology myself.
I agree. If we're going to look for acknowledging agreements, I agree on a level of that. I appreciate, it's kind of an agreement that I appreciate Mormonism tries to figure out the material reality. I appreciate that it tries to live in the material realm, and I agree that almost all their theology is kind of, you could call it workarounds. I guess it's supposed to be a revelation and all that sort of stuff, but it is all kind of trying to work out a logic to try to make sense of why all these meat bodies are here, and trying to figure out what we're doing. I agree that
it is so tied into. Go ahead.
I just agree that it's interesting to try to figure out what the purpose of why we're here, but doing it from a framework that is a physical reality that we're having to deal with.
Yeah. And I think I could say, if you start with the assumption that all of those theological points are true, I can agree that the church has actually let people down by not sticking to its guns about its theology and just saying, I'm sorry, I know it rubs people the wrong way, but this is just what we believe. This is what has been revealed. And so it's our task to make the best that we can with these realities. And I think I agree with Kwaku that the problem has been exacerbated by the church being a little bit wishy-washy on that. We may have differences of opinion about why that is, but within Mormonism, there are people who are much more in the literalistic side, and then there are people who are perhaps a little bit more loosey-goosey with how that theology is actually implemented. And so you can find people who are...
The spiritual 50% is always there to fill in the gaps, right? But the one of the things that these guys might not know is, like, in the ex-Mormon side of things, I've heard many different people state that some of the better concepts, not saying this is one of them or not, of Mormonism, they've kind of disliked how Mormonism has, or the powers that be in Mormonism have sold some of those concepts out over the years.
Yeah.
And there used to be a saying that what was unique about Mormonism isn't good, or what isn't. You probably know the thing, but
I've heard that.
Yeah, but I don't. I've heard many ex-Mormons say, no, what was unique about Mormonism was good. I've heard a lot of Mormons, and especially recently, we've had the thing come up about, are you going to have your own planet and world and that sort of stuff, and people disagreeing if they were taught it or not. But in the ex-Mormon community, there's been a lot of people who said that was one of the cooler concepts. You should have kept that concept. That was a neat, interesting theology. Why are you running from it?
Yeah.
And these guys might not know that.
Well, to Kwaku's point, the fact that there are some unique and special aspects of Mormonism does appeal to some people, and they've lost that appeal in trying to fit in with a wider Christian world. That Kwaku seems to be of the position that you lose something special in Mormonism when you do that, and I know there are a lot of people that agree with him in that regard. What about lessons learned on this particular clip?
Well, it might come up a bunch, so maybe I just might be worth saying once. But I'm just kind of shocked. I think I was asking you, I don't know for sure, these guys at one point or another were actually affiliated with Fair Farms or something. So I mean, I don't know for sure, but they're putting out some concepts, like some heavy criticisms of the old traditional, certain post-war, I guess. To use a slur, boomers, is that a slur now? But the boomer Mormons,
I don't know. I don't think it's a slur.
No, I don't think it is. But I've heard some people that age range get upset. My parents actually get upset at it.
Yeah.
And not that bad, but they still kind of go, "Why are you calling me a boomer? Don't do that." And these guys are heavily critical of that era of people, and under that era of people is all of the general authorities, and the lesson learned is maybe even some kind of on the inside in-group apologists are critical of what the general authorities are and how their general worldview is. I was shocked.
Well, I think that's what's going to come clear as we watch the rest of these videos, is that there is a degree of criticism, internal criticism and reflection on Mormonism as a whole that comes out in the comments that these guys make. And so I think one lesson learned is a lot of times we paint Mormons as these blind obedience, brainwashed. They're only going to parrot what the brethren say. They're never going to consider any other perspectives or have any variety of their thought. And I think when you hear some of the arguments that make here, it's harder to hold that caricature of the people who are speaking out in defense of Mormonism. And I think that's true here. And for me, that just... It helps me to humanize them more and to listen to them with a little bit more respect.
And to say it's only that I think that they're partially on the inside, partially funded, or have been with things at BYU or some of those organizations. I know it doesn't shock me. I know personally many Mormons who have those criticisms for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Now, respectfully respond. Is there anything that is a point of disagreement, would you say, with this particular clip?
I think kind of pointing out where the materialism concept of the God stuff breaks down is, it was part of trying to restate it responsibly and all that. But I mean, I think in itself, the logic of it somewhere down the line, is most of those types of things do, it breaks down. Like it breaks down if you really can completely scientifically, in almost kind of like a it's not science, but it sounds, like a scientific thing of like saying like this is all going to be happening in the scientific realm of we react to the physics of this universe, and the godliness parts of becoming gods still reacts to the physics of this universe. I mean, I think that's a response enough in itself, just saying that gets hard to follow.
Yeah. And this entire section here is kind of just trying to put a perspective and a framework around the response to Elder Holland's talk, which established boundaries about the church that represents the gospel and how the university that represents the church should filter its actions and its policies through the gospel, not through the standards of the world. And so the argument here is that the principles of the gospel are very material, concrete, and literal. And so the way we apply those is by having those boundaries that constrain the things that the university does so that it does not promote anything out of the standards. And if you hold that Mormonism is in that paradigm, universally for every member and for every leader, it makes sense. And this is where I would normally put a but I'm going to put an and I'm going to say, and if we expand that view of Mormonism to say that actually there are some Mormons, both members and leaders, who have a more expansive, more metaphorical view of the theology of the church, and even a more expansive view of the nature of God and man, the nature of what it means that there are children of God who are born gay and what that may imply into the eternities, and have honestly looked at the history of the church and seen principles that were doctrinal and considered to be concrete that later changed by nature of new light and new revelation, that this opens up a possibility that we can look to those changes in the future and start to have more expansive policies in the church that do permit a greater degree of dignity and allowable behavior that we would accept for heterosexual couples, that we can start to understand would be okay for gay couples. And so I would say just going from a very concrete, literal type of Mormonism to something that allows for more uncertainty and as a result, more progressive nature, and the idea that greater light and knowledge may come from the future is a different way that somebody could interpret these things and not agree with Kwaku.
Yeah, and I would also say to them, since they're able to, I mean, I think probably more so even than certain other types of Christians, kind of understand the material reality of having flesh bodies and being subject to physics and all that sort of stuff, that many people in the ex-Mormon community, not all of them, kind of have that materialist view of the world too. And if they don't think that kind of little extra added God parts at the end of it, they got this life to make what they can out of it, and if they're maybe viewing it like that, they got to go be the person they're going to be, and if that extra realm where it turns out that they can't make homosexual eternal children doesn't happen, they got to make it happen, or do it how they do it while they're alive in this life.
Yeah. It's interesting that because Mormonism is rooted so much in the real world, when you leave it, there's less things that you have to untangle in terms of the woo factor. Because I know that people who leave other traditions like Jehovah's Witnesses or Scientology, there's a degree of anti-science, or it's almost like spiritualism that is infused with what they have. So it's like you can get rid of the leaders of the church there, but then are we still mystical spiritual beings? And what does that mean? And it's I guess maybe it's not so much that there's an advantage, it's just it's a different experience coming out of Mormonism because of its material center in some sort of real universe in which men become gods.
It's so different that it was a very difficult struggle for me to try to figure out how other Christian religions thought about it. Like I was so in the Mormon material world that I watched quite a few different people from those other realms talk about how much more they view the entire religious experience symbolically or spiritually. Not it's almost none of even maybe kind of the Bible is happening right in this material realm. It's almost all just more a symbolic realm, and there are a lot of people believe that, and a lot of ex-Mormons and atheists get a little bit down on being able to understand that. They're pretty good at arguing with Bible Belt Christians that believe that it's all 100% in the material too, like 6,000 years old and all that stuff. But there's a huge swath of Christians that believe so much more of that's happening in a symbolic way, and it was hard for me to wrap my brain around that.
In that I feel the same way. That moment in the Book of Mormon musical, where the woman has learned that they're not going to Salt Lake City, and she goes back to the tribe, and she's like, "It's all a lie. It's all," and they're like, she's having her existential crisis, and they're like, "It's a metaphor," and I feel that way, coming out of the church, because the church told you what all the other churches were, and what religion is to a Mormon is what religion is to everybody else. And when you go out there and you realize that for many people, religion is a spiritual community that provides purpose and meaning and basic moral directions, but there's not like some unquestioned person that you can't go against. It's a community that fosters discussion about how we live in our world and try to learn from the traditions and histories of the past by not accepting them as writ, but by looking at through a lens of some core central ideals of love and empathy. And that spiritual vocabulary and culture that informs a community makes for a very different religious and spiritual life than what we assume church and religion is as Mormons. And I learned that by lucking into some communities that were able to educate me on that. I don't join because I just can't be a joiner, but I see that.
Yeah, I'm hard. I have a tough time saying I'm part of this or that or anything. But that's kind of one of the things, one of my larger criticisms myself of the entire ex-Mormon community is that the ex-Mormon community is Mormon. It's still thinking very Mormonly. It still acts very Mormonly. It still kind of thinks that every other religion is dealing with the same Mormon theology is just wrong. And it's just complete different paradigms and axioms that you don't even imagine. And sometimes it's good and really enlightening to figure out that it's not thinking exactly how Mormons thought. Even when you're an ex-Mormon, you go into it thinking you guys are I can just take you down with these empirical materialist arguments, and they're not even playing that game.
Yep, exactly. And I guess the part where I think ex-Mormons may find themselves in is where they go down that road and then they start becoming aware that there's different ways that people have conceptualized these things. And then they go back and they say, well, wait a second. What would it mean if I were to approach Mormonism with that same paradigm rather than the literal hierarchy, authority-driven paradigm? Is there anything in the wellspring of Mormon thought, theology, teaching that I can derive meaning and purpose in and find community in? And that's where I think Mormonism has the potential to have some power. The problem is those authoritarian boundaries that exist within the church that prevent it from flourishing as a community like that would, if someone tried to go back in, they would quickly or eventually be kicked right back out because they tried to operate in that mode in a realm that does not operate in that mode.
Yeah, for sure. And part of what you're just saying there, I know you and I have talked about it quite a bit, is, and these guys might not even know it, but in some sorts of ways, they're kind of taking up some of those arguments, not right in this moment. This moment's completely a materialist one, but they're the Mormon apologists are getting symbolic, or I don't know how else to say it. They're getting
they're getting I don't metaphorical want to say the word.
And they're getting weird with it, and in ways that are really surprising to me.
Yeah, no, I think you can say the word, which is that there's certain aspects of postmodernism that allow people to find much more reality in metaphor and meaning and run with it and have it detached from any objective, literal, concrete root or foundation, because that's the way you can preserve it. And the apologists have figured that out. And so it's interesting to see that in play.
Yeah.
Okay, let's
I didn't want to use it because it is a buzzword, but this is a very modernist argument. This is a modernist one, but these guys in other areas, maybe it'll come up here. They start getting very postmodern, you know.
Okay, so let's see. Let's go to our next clip, and that is going to be called "The Rhetorical Rules of War." Let me get to it.
I think
I'm going to bring this into our frame. All right. And this is clip number 2.
You know, where the critics come out of the woodwork, and we knew that they were going to anyway. I mean, it was inevitable. When I was listening to the speech, well, actually, my wife and I were watching it. It's in our minds. We know that we're going to see something a day, 24 hours later, where they're tearing down Elder Holland, and it's the little finite things that they pray about, that they ponder, that they things that we don't even know. We don't know what they do. We don't know what they talk about in their meetings, and the pain and the sorrow that they feel. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Yeah. And I think it was actually touching that he shared that, and it really bothers me when I see people saying like, oh, save your alligator tears, President Holland. I'm like, what? Why would you judge this man?
You're literally assigning dirty motives, which is like liberal don't break rule number 1.
Yeah. And like
all of these therapists that are coming out of the Wasatch Front, Twitter sphere talking about how, advocacy is allyship or whatever, all these little slogans that they're giving to virtue signal. It's like, you should know as a therapist that you don't assign people dirty motives. You will never have a healthy human relationship if you just keep going through assigning people dirty motives. So stop doing it to the leadership of your faith.
Yeah. And I think that that's one of the biggest things that is necessary in the fallout of this, because with Elder Holland, he kind of told us his motives over the pulpit, and we either get to believe him or not. And then we as members and who are not struggling with the LGBT, the way that Elder Holland phrased it was the LGBT challenge, which I think some people were also offended by. But I think he was talking about how challenging it can be to be an LGBT Latter-day Saint, right?
You don't get to say, be nice to me or I'll kill myself, and then not admit that it's a challenge.
I agree with you.
We have to demand some kind of consistency out of this, or else it's no longer an argument, but just a beatdown session.
Yeah, but I'm not seeing anyone say, be nice to me or I'll kill myself.
Literally in my feed yesterday, it was nothing but a bunch of links to the Trevor Project and a bunch of, reach out to me if you need to talk.
But there's an important difference there, Cardin. Wait for a second. Okay. You're seeing people say, be nicer or other people will kill themselves, right? They're not saying, or I will kill myself. They're saying other people will kill themselves. And I think there's an important rhetorical difference there.
No, they're standing on the graves of tragedies and then pushing their political agendas through a religious corridor using the most cynical leverage I've ever seen in my life. And I think there are things you tolerate in arguments and there are things you don't. Mm-hmm. Okay. There's rules of war, like the Geneva Convention. We all agree, okay, no more mustard gas. Mustard gas is just too toxic. Somewhere in this culture war, we have to say as a society, some things are too toxic and they're off limits. For me, I never go after another public figure's family. You've never seen me make fun of John DeLynne's family. You've never seen me make fun of his wife, his kids, his this, his that, because there's some things that I just think are off limits in this war of ideas. For them, there is not. They will literally accuse you of the unspeakable. Words I cannot say because this will be broadcast on YouTube and we will get a strike. But those come across all of the feeds of every one of these ex-Mormon, anti-Mormons every single day. And I'm sorry, in the Geneva Convention of online war of ideas, they are breaking the rules. They are toxic and they need to stop. And it needs to be not tolerated anymore.
And I think that the way to get there is to help them understand what it is that they're doing, right? I think the majority of these posts that I'm seeing are motivated by people trying to be compassionate, right? but then they're following.
Maybe the reposters.
Yeah, exactly. The reposters.
The people that are driving. There's a difference between leadership and laymen. Yes, of course.
Yeah. And I think that we need to be careful of that, because when we criticize the leadership and the laymen have been the people reposting things, sometimes they take that personally, right? And then we just have a deeper difficulty in getting everyone on the same page later, right?
Okay, well, this is why you're going to be apostle, not me.
I mean, okay, so what's kind of interesting to me is, and maybe because I'm from Texas and I'm a Southerner.
Okay, so that's 5 minutes of this discussion. What do you think so far?
Restating it.
So what are they saying here? Now, there were a couple of things that I think are worth mentioning that are coming up in the comments, and that is, disgusting. These guys are disgusting, and I can barely stand to listen to this, and the tone of that dude is so off-putting. And I think this is one of the challenges you're going to have when you discuss things with some people who just have a very forward, in your face, not everybody's going to be nice and polite and Rapoport's rules and your turn, my turn, your turn. And so how do you, because you can feel yourself rising up to it and you want to rise to match it, or you want to just slap him and, go off. So I think being aware that visceral reaction is normal, but you don't have to react to it. You don't have to lean into it. And you just have to remind yourself here, I'm here to share perspective and ideas, regardless of the way in which they do it. It's, for my part, I'm trying to do what I'm trying to do. So
they're
restating responsibly.
They're discussing the principle of charity, right? A friend of mine, he just texted me and reminded me that one time he posted like the Wikipedia on what the principle of charity is on an ex-Mormon forum and got banned for it. And that's literally all he posted,
So what is the principle of charity? We've alluded to it.
It's what they're begging for right there, and that's like, stop and give us basically this treatment that we're trying to do right here. Give us the concept of trying to take our argument for what it's meant at its best. Like what are we really trying to get across? Are we just evil demons trying to say an evil demon thing, or are we trying to make a point, and this is one of those areas that gets total Hatfield McCoy, because both sides will, you didn't charitably interpret me, you didn't charitably interpret me, well, you didn't charitably interpret me. And then part of that is like, it's even like a meta thing of like, you didn't do that on purpose because you didn't do that. It's mind reading. It all gets into levels of mind reading. That's usually kind of a bad way to go about anything. They are saying that there's emotional manipulation happening on the side of the arguments that are against Holland, and maybe it's simply stated as that. But right in the same thing,
they start out by mentioning that critics of Holland are accusing him of emotional manipulation. Oh, he cried. He's fake crying, pretending to be hurt, pretending that this is just a that he's the victim while they hurt vulnerable people. And so they're saying this is the accusation being levied towards the brethren. And the point that they're making is, have some charity. If you get emotional and you're talking to someone about things, you want people to believe what you're saying, and to, if you show emotion, that is part of what you're communicating. So extend that reciprocally to Elder Holland.
But then,
and then they go to what you're mentioning.
Yeah. So it starts for begging for it, and then it goes into a criticism or a turning the tables on that. And I mean, that's kind of apparent that they're flip-flopping right there. But I mean, most of those things ultimately just kind of get down to, you need to know the heart of the person. And I completely would agree that sometimes on either side people emotionally manipulate, and on either side people sometimes are completely genuine and honest, and it's almost impossible to always tell. I brought it up to you, some evidence that sometimes Holland himself knowingly emotionally manipulates. I was in the MTC. Maybe somebody out there has also seen the video, corroborate it for me or whatever. But in the MTC, there's some MTC specific.
Okay, hold on.
Video.
We have to play this game. We have to play this game where before we can offer any measure of criticism, we have to be summarizing and do these things. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and it's hard to do, you know. Okay, someone is suggesting that you turn your mic up a little bit. I don't know about that.
Me?
I can hear you good, but yeah.
Okay. I could talk louder too. I have a generally kind of quiet
voice.
Okay,
that's okay. So there's the pivot moment is where they say that people are assigning dirty motives to the leaders of the church. And if you want to talk about dirty motives, when he said that it's an LGBT challenge, people then assign dirty motives. They say you shouldn't use that word. There's a better word. And then they moved into you can't claim to be the victim or claim that they're emotionally manipulating you as long as you're citing suicide statistics on the issue of LGBT people in the church.
That's an issue I've asked you about directly to get your insight on, and because sometimes
it's a tough
I don't
one.
know, you know.
Yeah, I think that if you just step back a little bit and just say, there are a bunch of different arguments that you can use in the discussion about the LGBT challenge, and it is a challenge. I would agree with them when they say that regardless of whether or not you believe in the church, there are people in the church who hold it close to their spiritual heart who are LGBT. And so they have a challenge that people who are totally ready to just toss the church out and live their life without having to worry about it, there's a challenge that they have that those people don't have. And it may be that you don't like that you're saying that they're the ones with the challenge rather than it's the church that has the challenge on how to be a healthy spiritual home for these people. And I think both of those things are true. They're not mutually exclusive. The question of using suicide, and I think it's either in this discussion or in another discussion, they bring up the point of, if somebody tells you, you have to do what I want you to do or I'm going to kill myself, we would, in any other issue, say, well, that's a form of manipulation. It's trying to use coercion. It's along the same lines that ex-Mormons would say Joseph Smith did when he said, you have to marry me or an angel is going to kill me. By using some external threat, either to yourself or to someone you respect, revere, or love, as a way to compel you to comply, then you're stepping outside of the actual issue and trying to bring some other element into it. And to the extent that that is manipulation, you could look at citing statistics like that and saying it's manipulative. And I think what they allude to later on in this discussion is that there's a danger in doing that. And that is that if you simply end the conversation there and say, well, he said bad things about gay people and the gay people are going to kill themselves, so he needs to stop saying bad things about gay people, then you might miss if there's actually some legitimate research and study that points to a better, more accurate description of the problem at the root of youth suicides. If you assume you already know the answer, you may blind yourself to something that is even more powerful as an explanatory cause to it. And so that is where you have to tread very carefully in simply going straight to that argument against it. So I would love to be able to say, you should never invoke youth suicides as an argument. It should stick to hard facts and things on the proactive side. I think you just have to take the big picture. And I think people in the church have started to validate that there are real emotional and spiritual and interpersonal consequences to the way that the church goes about implementing its theology. And maybe we've seen they've taken some terrible missteps. I think the 2015 policy would be an example of that. And I think I'm kind of just trying to articulate that I understand the perspective that they're having here. And I think they would agree that there have been some missteps, and they allude to it in how the church has responded in the past. But it's terrible when it takes longer to restate their position than they take stating it.
Well, I think partially because you could state it almost too fast. Like I can state one and two. Emotional manipulation happens. That's the restate on both sides. Number two, acknowledge agreements. Yes, yeah, that happens on both sides. The problem is like it's such a thing about mind reading and knowing about people's hearts that it's almost impossible to decipher out what anybody's feeling at any moment or any time. You're just in a realm of not being able to pull out all the evidence in the world to cite something like that.
He mentions rhetorical rules of war, and I think that's something that it doesn't exist.
We're trying to put
because we can't enforce it. Yeah. Well, that's the thing is that you want to be very careful about who gets to set the rhetorical rules of war, because then those rules are going to be used against you. But I think there's something to it, not in terms of who's going to get punished for what, but in terms of what is going to be effective at reaching hearts and minds, what is going to be persuasive and increase or not divisive, not create enemies. And I think we would probably agree things like emotional manipulation are things you want to avoid if you're trying to authentically and legitimately make a case for your position. And there's probably others.
But to still man that, one of the things I've noticed, because I've been in ex-Mormonism so long, I just recently looking, it's been like exactly half my life, like 20 years out, 20 years in, I left a little bit after my mission, somewhere around 21, I'm around 42 now. I've watched over the years in the ex-Mormon world as it went from all kind of empirical study, which is stuff I really liked, I really enjoyed, kind of like, let's look at these empirical truth claims and dissect them and that sort of stuff, to, I think everybody's noticed, somewhere around 2012, 2015, emotional arguments, all emotional arguments. And the emotional world has done more to pull people out of Mormonism than the empirical time did, And I think that just goes to show that just like emotion converts people into Mormonism, it also works better to convert them out. I'm just talking about effectiveness. I don't know if that means it was a better method of getting out. I definitely got out, and a couple of my friends definitely got out just looking at empirical truth claims and almost had no emotional or kind of like moral response to it other than following truth. I think there's been way more movement towards ex-Mormonism since it's kind of shift over to using the emotional realm in the social media world in the past 10 years.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
And some of that's real emotion and some of that's manipulative.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the challenges that is expressed in what he's saying here that you allude to is when you're dealing with church leaders, when you're dealing with anyone who, we know that there are manipulative people out there are deceivers out there. Mormons would agree that there are religious leaders in other denominations that use deception and manipulation. So we can all agree that is something that is out there. And so how do you suss out, how do you figure out if someone is emotionally manipulating you when someone's crying? If you have a family member that comes to you crying, do you just assume that they're trying to manipulate you out the back? And is that a pathway that is going to come to a resolution? And the problem is that there's some people who figure out that most people naturally will accept it and they won't be skeptical of it or cynical of it, and they'll try to empathize and connect with you. We have circuits in our brain that are these empathy circuits. When you come to me crying, I'm going to connect and respond. But there's some people who figure that out and they know that they can use that to get what they want. And so
it's case by case, and it's so hard. But you have to, especially as you're somebody who's realized you're being in this world where emotional argumentation, the pathos works better than the logos, as far as persuasion goes. Over the years, you have to stop back and look and see that people understand and take advantage and use how you will react to emotional arguments better than other situations, and it does get abused. A book that I read, not a lot of people go crazy for it just because you use some certain terms. People aren't happy because they want to think of something as only positive. But there's a book by, I think it's Paul Bloom, called something against empathy or something like that. And the whole entire book is kind of like the concept about how empathy can get out of hand. It can get to a place where, especially if like you get to like a level where you're infantilizing someone who shouldn't be infantilized, or like one of the concepts with empathy that always kind of comes up. If you become like an empathetic being and you become a mama bear and you start treating everybody you know that you're taking care of as your baby cubs. Well, what's the most dangerous animal in the wild? Is a mama bear, you know. Bear. And sometimes mama bears attack predators and get rid of those predators and get them right out. Sometimes mama bears attack a guy walking in the forest, you know. And you have to kind of understand that any sort of thing has too far with it, and you have to just be kind of constantly watching.
I think those are excellent points, and I think they fall both under the lessons learned and the respectfully respond aspect of this. There's something to this acknowledgement that emotional manipulation exists, and that it's hard to tell what it is, and it's best to take it on a case-by-case basis. Start from a position of charity, and don't assign bad motives, but allow yourself to learn. If you've been burnt, if a pattern of behavior has been established, then you kind of do have to start acknowledging that there's a precedent that changes that paradigm of starting with charity. And I think that's where a lot of ex-Mormons approach talks like this. Is a lot of ex-Mormons have already extended multiple opportunities to the church to give them good faith, to assign good motives, and they feel like they've been burned. And so that's why it's harder for them not to take a cynical response or a response that assumes a bad motive for something like this. And that's their lived experience. So if you want to allow that to, just acknowledge that is where some people are coming from. So it is understandable that they respond in that way. And you could tell them that if you just apply that type of response to every relationship in their life, it's probably not going to work out that well. And it's very true, because we cannot live our lives assuming bad intent, assuming bad motives, and not extending charity to anyone. It's incompatible with good relationships. But I don't think people are doing that, to everyone. And the people that are doing it towards the church leaders don't do it from out of the blue. There's some personal history in each of those cases. But even when that's the case, it's important not to go too far with it. Okay. You mentioned something, which was infantilization, that they actually get into next.
They did.
Is there anything else you want to say?
Well, I didn't even really get to the respectfully respond on them. As far as
what would you say on that?
Well, like I said, Holland, he had that video that in the MTC, somebody else has to have seen it, where he basically sits down. And I say basically, it's much more closer to like precisely says, if you go and teach like the scriptures, you go give a first discussion and you come back and people didn't read the scriptures, you need to pull out the waterworks. You need to cry. You need to act emotionally and get upset that they didn't do the reading. And I know somebody else has seen this video. I know I'm not hallucinating it, but it's something that
you mentioned this before, and I hadn't heard, because I think you just said cry, but when you said, I don't think you used the word waterworks, and I think I have heard someone describe this video before.
Yeah, he definitely says,
and it's showing in the MTC two missionaries.
Showing two missionaries. It was only like a 10-minute video, and it was like, you need to just show them that it's the most important thing in the world, and you need to show it to this. But what I'm referring to is that this is a guy who has put on film that he knows how to use the waterworks for manipulative purposes, and is willing to do that. Is he doing that all the time? I mean, you never know somebody's heart right in the moment, but he's somebody who's admitted to doing that sort of thing, or even advocated for it in that old paradigm of using the commitment pattern that we used to use. So there is some outward evidence that this is a guy that will tend to do that, and I've seen him. I've had problems with Holland myself over the years from other situations, and people keep saying that he's the nice apostle and whatever. And I think that almost kind of comes down to because he's able to cry so easy. And myself, who on any side, when crying starts happening, maybe I'm unfortunately kind of quick to start putting an eye at it, I almost think that in a sense it makes him kind of one of the more harsh, or like I don't understand the concept that people say, oh, he's just the nicest, and it's partially because these same guys are getting emotionally manipulated. Like, look, he's crying, but don't get emotionally manipulated by that other side, but I would say to them, like, maybe stop and ask when all those crying patterns come out from general authorities, which we've all seen over the years. Maybe that is the same thing too,
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go on this subject of infantilization. It's there's something that happens on the issue of race. A lot of people say, well, when people are vicariously fighting to end racism or to act anti-racist, the white savior is something that comes out, and you end up infantilizing, or basically making arguments as though Black people couldn't make those arguments themselves, or as though they were weak and not able to actually engage in these conversations. And people say that it's a form of racism, of soft bigotry. And they're using a similar argument in this next segment, I believe. Let's see what they say on the issue of race, of LGBT issues. So Kwaku hits us with it here.
Okay, so what's kind of interesting to me is, and maybe because I'm from Texas and I'm a Southerner, and the gay people I knew in high school were also Texas Southerners, but they were tough. And I get to Utah, and all I'm seeing is, insert vagueness here. If the church doesn't change its doctrine, meaning change its ceremony that you already said was Freemasonic and weird, you know what I mean? If the church doesn't change this ceremony, this very specific niche esoteric ceremony about becoming a god in the next life that also involves marriage and sex, if you do not change this ceremony, then people will kill themselves. The gay people I grew up with were way tougher than that. Like, isn't it almost insulting that they're saying, like, hey, this ceremony in that building that only a quarter of the 2% of the people who actually have subscribed to that religion, and then of that quarter, only 1/4 of that quarter will go into that ceremony. If you do not change that ceremony specifically, then all these people will kill themselves. I don't believe that's true. I do not believe that's true. And also, let me say, there's been a lot of connections with race in Utah. People said, well, the church had the 1978 revelation and allowed black men to hold the priesthood. Is this the same thing as that? Not once in the past couple of years, as BLM and all that stuff has happened, have I heard one black person say, stop police brutality or I will kill myself. Nor have I heard any white person say, we must stop this or the black people will kill themselves. Why is it that all these Utah journalists just go stand on the graves of dead LGBT kids and say, you better change this doctrine and change your scriptures, or Billy and Sally will kill themselves? To me, that just seems insulting, not only to LGBTQ people, insulting to anybody. It's just it's such a cynical look at society and such a push of weakness.
And I would say it's beyond insulting. It's actually damaging, because I think you could have had a ton of people just ignore that this talk ever even happened. But now you have people sharing this as though it's a reasonable response for them to think that suicidal ideation is a reasonable response to an old man telling all of these people at BYU that they need to be doing better at defending their faith.
Plus, it's almost like you're almost promoting that ideation by constantly referencing it as a coping mechanism that I don't think would come naturally if it were not so overrepresented as a suggestion in social media.
It's also fake. It's fake. They never share stats. This is going back to 2016. Every single time some grifting ex-Mormon journalist who wants to make money off of ex-Mormons who are going through emotional pain from leaving the church, they always say, all these gay kids are killing themselves right now. They never provide stats. Every single time someone's looked into those stats, they don't show up. It is completely fake. It's false.
Okay, it's not that there's not any suicides happening. It's that there's many cases where they've misrepresented data that was not specific. For example, there was the year about 5 years ago where
that's what I'm saying.
The amount of suicides doubled, right? And they immediately blamed it on the policy of exclusion, as they called it, and said, look, this is perfect evidence, until you actually read the study and you found out they never self-reported sexual orientation. Okay. They didn't self-report half of the other data that shows up in all of the other reports. And some of these children, dare I say, that were self-deleting, and I have to use that term because this will probably get shown on YouTube, were as young as 5th graders, prepubescents who couldn't report a sexual orientation if they wanted to. And I'm sorry, but state of Utah, if you have 5th graders deciding to take their own lives that are prepubescents, you've got a much bigger problem on your hands that you need to start addressing here. And we all need to start being intellectually honest and figure out what it is. And instead of laughing at people that might say, could it be the elevation? We actually maybe should start looking into that. Instead of laughing at people that saying, you know, could it be the fact that, you know, people in Oregon have higher depression levels because there's less sun? And is it like, maybe we need more PEA outside? I mean, I'm literally just spitballing here, but it's, they stand on the graves of these kids and they absolutely shove a political agenda of you better pass AB 156723 or else you're a bad person. And it's all run by guilt. And as a liberal, I am the biggest 1990s liberal you will ever meet. Okay. I don't know a single person in my ward that wasn't for the Domestic Partnerships Act of California. I don't know a single person in my ward that thought, oh yeah, gay people shouldn't be able to go visit their partners in hospitals. I don't know a single Mormon that thinks that way. And anybody that says, oh, we're a conservative religion, I laugh at them because I'm like, dude, we give up the mic on the first Sunday of every month for an open mic session where every person is regarded as equal. We are the closest thing to intellectual socialists as you can get. One Sunday every month, while everybody else is making money off of their grift, all right, other churches included, we're straight out passing up the mic. And yeah, we might be socially conservative in many regards, such as like traditional marriage, okay, but we are the most fiscally liberal people out there. You go look at the donations of any one of these ex-Mormon podcasting grifters, and they still have yet to donate an equivalent of the 10% that they used to pay for tithing that the church doesn't need, and instead ends up becoming the largest provider of clothing to the third world. So
All right. My audio is totally out of sync. That's okay. So there's a lot there. This is one of those things where you have to be selective in what you respond to. There are some points that are more important than others. I don't know that responding to the tithing jab at the end is necessary. What is the overall argument they're making here in this particular part?
The overall argument is it's more on the emotional manipulations and manipulations using statistics and that type of thing. Then getting into the point that Mormons in general are far more liberal and open socially than people are giving them credit for. They really act like they're backwoods, you know, every single Mormon's some
yokel.
Yeah, yokel. Yep, for sure. And yeah, it was just kind of getting into more of how there's media manipulations on top of it, and
well, I want to explore that topic a little bit more, because I think what they're saying here is that people who are using the argument of LGBT suicides would need to back that up with data. They would need to provide statistics that would allow that argument to actually hold. And their position is that when you go and look at the data, that it doesn't actually reflect what people using this argument make. So and if that's the case, then the argument is fallacious. Would you say that's what they're trying to reach to?
Yeah, although I wouldn't say that they achieve full fallacious. It's just not as strong as the other side made it sound.
Okay.
But because they admitted that there are situations that did happen. It's just, I actually had this experience myself. I watched that Dan Reynolds movie, and then I saw him on the Trevor Noah show. And the way Dan presented the suicide statistics on the Trevor Noah show, you could probably go watch it. You kind of put it in a certain order of Utah has one of the highest suicide rates in the country. And since 2008, LGBT suicides have quadrupled. And so it's kind of like a bit of a non sequitur between two things. And you hear it and you think, are there 4,000 suicides a year in Utah of LGBT people. And then you go look at it, and there are actual statistics, and those statistics are it went from 8 to 32. And I think there was truth that there was some fudging around that to try to make it sound worse than it is. And this is where I kind of get into like some of the Jonathan Haidt points of when you become an activist, you get fudgy with truth over just being a general truth seeker. And that maybe happens for a reason. People think it needs to happen for utilitarian reasons. It doesn't take away from the fact that maybe those 32 situations did happen, but they also, if you read about them, it is very, very assumed of what the suicides were for or not. There's not very many cases where we have absolute proof that it was for this reason. And there was obviously an activist point made by Dan Reynolds in his video to make it sound like something else, and they were for sure trying to make it sound that way. Now, to give credit to the other side, just this week on John DeLynne's podcast, I heard them mention that 32 number. They were straight honest about it, and they weren't hiding the ball right that time. And that was one of the first times that I heard it just kind of come out straight like that. And their point was that 32 number is still bad, and that's true. You know,
I think there are things that make intuitive sense. And so even without having statistics behind it, people who have experienced some things can understand the truth of something and see a moral position on it, even if it doesn't scale to the cataclysmic numbers that are maybe implied by the language. So, I think any Mormon guy who grew up in the church understands the sense of self-loathing over your own failures and imperfections on things like the law of chastity. And then you can just take that and then extrapolate that, if you are not gay, into what type of self-loathing and hatred happens when you feel that your entire person is somehow antithetical to God and his purposes, that your natural inclinations and attractions are somehow wicked and evil, because that's what a lot of people grew up in. That's the paradigm they grew up in under the old rhetoric of the church. And so when you hear statistics about youth suicide, you immediately believe, if not in the truth of it, in the truthiness of it. Just like it doesn't matter how many thousands or not thousands of youth suicides are, those teachings are psychologically damaging. And to the extent that there's a bunch of people out there hating a part of themselves, even if they don't engage in suicide, does not, you're still on the right moral side of the argument from that perspective. I think, go ahead.
I think any sort of Mormon can understand with that scrupulosity of thinking that I'm almost near wanting to not even deal with this life because I'm feeling so much like I can't live up to the Mormon standards. Mm-hmm. And then you could also take it to the next step of, wow, if you're LGBT and there's no out, there's no time, there's no place where you're going to get to a repentance or to where you can finally indulge and not feel sinful about it and that sort of thing. I mean, that's got to be an added level for sure.
Yeah,
absolutely. So, and go ahead.
No, the dangers of removing the force of your argument from actual data and statistics are that people are going to refute your statistics and feel like they've won the moral argument because you haven't focused on the strongest aspects of your argument.
Yep.
And I feel like what they're doing here is they're saying, listen, there's been some misrepresentation of the statistics in the past, and so you, in a sense, you really can't trust anyone. And not only that, but we've got a newspaper and television reporting media that are politically or in their orientation, and they're using the same manipulation of data to try to force political initiatives and compel the church to go against its theology. And all of these forces, because if they can say that you've been manipulating data, then they can cast doubt on the entire enterprise that would try to point out issues that exist within the church. And that's going to appeal to a lot of people who have woken up to this idea that you can't trust the media. Everything's politically motivated. There's power trying to be forced through even just what is true and what is real. And so now I'm going to doubt everything. And I'm not going to trust any media, and it's going to create what we're having now.
You can have the same reaction to finding out stuff like that I had when I first Googled all the stuff 20 years ago about the Mormon Church. And you see all this stuff that, it turns out this went this way, and it turns out that went that way. And just, you could have a general emotional reaction to what? Like they were saying one thing and it turns out it's another way. And that's why, especially when you get to a point where you're making motivated points that are motivated in activism, that could even be, utilitarian wise, you think you're aiming at a good goal, at saying a good thing, but if you fudge numbers and fudge them purposefully, you're gonna have backlash to that, and you should expect some backlash to that.
Yeah. So what they're saying then is that people are in bad faith, manipulating statistics to try to force the church to change its policies. They're using it in a mode that appeals to people's empathy, and so it's a form of emotional manipulation, and that they're blowing it out of proportion because, from their perspective, in reality, the only people that are really affected by this would be the small percentage of people who are Mormon and the smaller percentage of people who decide to get sealed in the temple. And so I think that's their central argument in this part of the thing. Now, to the extent that I think we've expressed some agreement that when you state statistics, you need to make sure that you're keeping them both accurate, as well as not trying to use word games to present a proportionality that is not accurate.
Don't be afraid of the actual statistics. The actual statistics can still help your argument. Stay true to them.
Yeah.
But there's a second part to this, and their second part is a part that I absolutely agree with, is that I don't know what backwoods Mormons you're talking about. I'm a Salt Lake City Mormon. My Facebook feed is full of very, very Democrat Mormons. In fact, that's all I see. I absolutely believe that maybe in some other sorts of areas like Vernal or whatever, it probably gets like full whatever. But I'm not nothing is. I don't know what Vernal is. I just threw something out. But it's in Salt Lake City. In Salt Lake City, everybody is kind of what I call like an NPR Mormon. They're all 100% dialed into NPR. My whole entire family is. I brought up the Holland Talk to my parents during. My dad's a stake patriarch. My parents just went full. Oh gosh, I wish he didn't talk about that. I don't know what world. I believe it's there. I believe there's some people whose feeds have all the worst parts of Mormonism in it, or not Mormonism, kind of that political identity of super right-wing Mormonism. But I don't see that world in Salt Lake City, Utah. I see what these guys are talking about. In fact, these guys, and one of the things that was a lesson learned for me, they didn't say it here, they're almost like on the progressive end of politics beyond being Mormon. I mean, they're for UBI, they're for all these different situations that would have blown my mind hearing that coming from Mormons 10, 12, 15 years ago. But it's the same with my parents. My parents over time, they're still as Mormon as ever, but they have across 20 years completely flipped to socially liberal, and if that's the word for it. And there's somewhat of a straw manning in general of what the church is, or what its populace is in general, when people get into these different Facebook arguments. Once again, not to bring up or call stuff out, but I heard on that very same podcast with John DeLunas, they basically said there's either like progressive Mormons or there's alt-right Mormons. And I go, what? Yeah. Where? Like, maybe, I'm sure they're out there, but all I see in my feed is these NPR Mormons. So that's everybody I know who grew up in Murray, Utah. I'll shout y'all out. Maybe you'll see me, like, check in. You're not, there's no such thing as like alt-right Mormons in that area. Maybe a couple, but they're not my friends. So
yeah. I think that it's easy. Yeah, I would agree with you there. The pushback they're giving on this idea that all Mormons are these rednecks, Trump supporters, is just pointing to the fact that a lot of people who are critical of the church make broad assumptions about people who are Mormons because of the things that the church itself teaches. And then they assume that all of the Mormons accept all of those things with a complete paradigm of blind obedience. And I think that's a real danger.
Yeah, there was an article.
Well, I was going to finish that thought.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
There was an article in the Atlantic just a couple months back, kind of right after the election, and it was by a guy who's been a longtime writer for them, who's a Mormon. If you read the whole entire article, which far more kind of represents the and it's probably BYU. The NPR Mormons are BYU Mormons. That Atlanta article was basically acknowledging, saying, hey, we really weren't so Trumpy as you think we are. You really look at all these different statistics. Please don't give us a Maoist revolution. Please don't make us go back to year zero. Let us keep some of those things. Like if you read the whole entire argument, that's basically all it's saying. And but he knows, as well as, I mean, not all Mormons know it, but Holland knows that those moments of reconciliation are coming to a head.
Yeah. Well, it's dangerous if you're trying to really connect with someone and really have a discussion bear fruit for you to make broad generalizations, particularly uncharitable generalizations. I've had this same experience in discussions with my brother, one of my brothers. I hadn't really dove into a lot of these deep subjects about, and it's just been really interesting to learn that he has much more social progressive views on many different things than I would. I mean, he's making socialist arguments. So now I have to start arguing about socialism to him. But, but he's a faithful Mormon. I'm just like, what, this is, we're going to eat the rich. And anyway, it's just
not only lessons learned for me, it's like mind blown, like lessons learned, especially like I kind of start seeing that side has really kind of altered a lot in the past 20 years. And I was a bit checked out of seeing that happen.
Yeah. And that's where really connecting with the people that you're talking with and making sure you're talking to a person and not just battling ideologies that don't necessarily represent the person that you're, discussing. So any response to this that would perhaps be a point of disagreement?
Even if those numbers are smaller, they're still there,
Yeah.
And on the flip end,
I think that to add to that would just be that the idea that teachings bear fruit in the culture and lives of the people, particularly in a church that does have a leadership hierarchy and authority that the church does, those teachings do have consequences and they get reflected in the hearts of people. And the thing that informs me of that is if you want to know what this feels like, then look at the letters that were sent to Stuart Udall after he made a public appeal as Secretary of the Interior for the Mormon Church to change its policy on priesthood and temple ban restrictions for Black people. A bunch of members, not leaders, a bunch of members took it upon themselves to write him letters and tell them what he thinks. And what you're seeing when you read those letters, if you Google who's on the Lord's side who, Stuart Udall, you'll come across either a YouTube video or a blog post that I have that goes through these letters. But you'll see the teachings of the leaders reflected in the hearts and minds of the members as they engage with each other. And just understanding that principle is at play should be enough for you to see how the tone and the theology and the teachings of the church get reflected in the lives and the hearts of the members. And on this issue of how people interact with and coexist with and love their LGBT family members and people in their communities should give you some pause to say that, the church certainly in the past has made some mistakes. And so we can't simply assume that everything that they do is going to be right, and just allow yourself to have differences of opinion or disagreement, particularly if they are in the direction of love and acceptance of LGBT people who will be at the receiving end of that consequence.
Yeah, you'd want to, with some things, you take a more phenomenological view of it rather than like a positivist view. Like, let's just look at the data, or let's look at the different situations, and then that sort of concept can go too far too. But if you're on an individualist level, you for sure want to talk or figure out what the precise situation of a person is and be open and empathetic to it. And then the flip end of that is some of their kind of claims of the church being socialist, and that because socialist ideologically, and that because people can get up and talk every Sunday or every month or whatever.
Yes.
I do agree at the very top, as we've always seen, it's kind of slowly changing, and then the masses are changing a bit faster, and that's what the top's trying to deal with. But come on, you know that you're only allowed to say certain amounts of things, or pre-approved things when you get up, and like any kind of socialist system, like you say it's open and free, but like it gets far more authoritarian than you want to.
Yeah, we're the most socialist group because we have people talk. It's like, I mean, if you say the wrong things, you'll find yourself in a gulag if you're in a socialist environment. And if you say the wrong things and you're in an authoritarian paradigm, you may find yourself at the end of church discipline, or even just isolation from your peers because you become an ideological contagion. But there is an element of truth that there is the framework for people to get up and speak their mind without somebody telling them specifically what to say. And I know that,
and they talk about also that, not right here, but in another part, they talk about how like there is a truth that like they have to vote to sustain their profits and all that sort of stuff. So there is like some sort of democratic level to that. But we all know, I mean, it's one of those things that, in a long time of ex-Mormonism, that there's kind of a thing that they'll say, no, that totally was a democratic process, or you could totally say whatever you want every month. But we were in it, like we know, and I agree that things have kind of shifted over the years, but come on, like it's not really like a democratic process. It's not really free form speaking every month.
Yeah. And if you want to try to apply some sort of social dynamic element to it, there is a phenomenon where when groups of people get together and somebody verbalizes a belief or does it serves the purpose of unifying belief and identity in a social group. And it doesn't matter whether or not the thing that you're verbalizing a belief in exists, it formulates and strengthens belief. And so there's a social dynamic that serves that you can find in other groups that we would identify as exerting undue influence or being high demand religions, and that structure is part of how they reinforce those beliefs. And so while you could look at this concept of fast and testimony meeting as an egalitarian socialist type thing, it also could serve the purpose of this reinforcement of belief and group identity, regardless of its purposes. So the next clip is one under the title of Metaphorical Muskets. It's shorter than the others, so let's take a look. Let's see here.
I've just reached a point, me personally, where it's like, this is unsustainable. Like, we can have a conversation when it is indeed a conversation. But when you come out and say that I am no longer qualified as a participant in this conversation because I want to delete other people with a muzzle-loaded black powder weapon from 250 years ago, instead of recognizing and being intellectually honest, the metaphor that it was, they could have just as easily said he was advocating for violence with rusty trowels. And if we're going to be this intellectually dishonest, every person that was saying Jeffrey R. Holland was advocating for violence now needs to protest Hamilton, because in Hamilton they had muskets. And was Hamilton literally suggesting widespread assassination of all political leaders from the 1800s? Like literally, if we are going to say that Jeffrey R. Holland was suggesting violence against gay members of the church, we literally need to march down to the Pantages Theater and protest Hamilton as the violent outburst of political leadership that it really is. But we're not going to do that, and nor am I advocating for that, those who want to clip this, okay? We're not going to do that because all of us here know that was a metaphorical musical that blended the cool fusion of modern music with the old school wigness of 1770s, fashion. We all know that Jeffrey R. Holland was using a metaphor of the modern Minuteman with the religious war of ideas. That's it.
And this is where I think the problem lies, because we know that, but I think people who are being told otherwise, with either without having read his speech or with reading his speech after, but having the idea implanted that he's calling for violence against them, that's the thing that I think is the bigger problem. You have people telling people in the LGBTQ community, hey, you have an apostle calling for violence against you. Look at what he said, right? And saying this sort of thing and weaponizing their fear against the church. Yeah. I think that that's such a horrible, horrible thing for them to be doing. And I really think the only way for us to try to combat that is the real problem here isn't even what Holland said. It's the whole conversation that's happening after. And I think if we did a better job of trying to love our neighbors and help anybody that we know who's LGBTQ know that we love them and care about them and that we would never point a musket at them ever. If they, the more they know that, the less likely they are to believe when some grifter comes along saying, hey, this is what is being said by LDS apostles.
And I agree.
Yes.
Because, I mean, the reality.
All right.
So I've just reached the point, personally.
There we go. He just reached a point, him personally. Okay, so sometimes when you're trying to restate responsibly so that you can make the argument better than they made it, you don't necessarily have to use or refer to the metaphor that they used, particularly if it was a weak metaphor. So I don't know that we need to address Hamilton, but what is
yeah, I thought that was a bad jump too, but I thought you were talking about
what's
just
their
musket
point?
in general.
If we wanted to, if we wanted to restate the gist of their argument here, I think there's two main aspects of it. What would you rephrase it as?
It was obviously used by Jeffrey L. Holland in a turn of speech of being just defensive of your position to use that musket concept, and he was not talking about actually grabbing a musket and shooting anybody. It was well, you'd have to say his metaphor. I was going to say turn of phrase, but he did use it multiple times, right? And I guess they've used it. You've put up a video of them using it multiple times lately. He was probably just following from somebody else using it, and
yeah, he was quoting Dallin H. Oakes, who quoted Neil A. Maxwell, and it was recently used by John Gee in the Fair Mormon Conference.
Oh, really?
So he was just kind of he's reusing some words that have been applied in the context of having BYU faculty and staff stay true to their positions as representatives of a religious organization.
So it's obviously some sort of continued metaphor. Is there an idea behind that at all, that they want it to turn into some sort of stochastic terrorism, which is the concept that you put an idea out there and then somebody else will take it out, do it for you? I don't think it would be. I think it's a bit of a stretch to think those guys would be doing that on purpose. Maybe in Joseph Smith's and Brigham Young's day, although they probably just would have done it. And I don't think these guys were intending to create a situation like that. The other end of it is, should they have been smart enough to not delve into that realm in today's society and how that stuff is? And they brought it up, I think, somewhere else, that like these guys themselves brought up that maybe they need a diversity reader to read over their topics and say, hey, this could be a landmine that using this term right here or something like that. I agree with them somewhat, because I don't think they said it here either, but like some of it's a bit of the out of touchness. These guys say that it's a bit of the out of touchness of the top boomer brass, as they put it.
Yeah, I agree. What they're saying here is, listen, the rules of conversation include that you can use metaphors and you don't have to take them as literal. And so that's what was happening here. And, beyond that, there's this idea of weaponizing, where you take a bad faith interpretation of a metaphor and then you throw it in the face of other people and you say, look, he means you harm. And that's a way to, get the church by weaponizing something they say through a bad faith interpretation. And all of that can be true, that's that's a legitimate criticism of how this has played out in the social media narrative and in the way of critics of the church, he makes a point in a different discussion that ex-Mormons also engage in metaphor. And so this is where, in addition to the criticism that they make that you're taking a metaphor and bringing it into the literal realm, they could also say, not only that, but if we're going to do that, and I think this is a stronger point than the Hamilton thing, we can take those instances where there's this an acronym called BTFDT or something like that. It's burn it the flip down with the truth. And so you'll see BTFDWTT everywhere there. So that is a metaphor saying burn the church down with the truth that ex-Mormons use. There have been a spate of fires set of LDS chapels in a part of the country, and they found somebody who did that. Were they somebody who was ex-Mormon who was trying to do that, fulfilling the stochastic terrorism call of burn it the flip down with the truth? Or was it somebody who was an anti-vaxxer who believed that the church had lost its way? There's different modes that could lead to that type of action, but they're all require somebody who's a little bit unhinged to act out on those things. But if you're going to say that the church is wrong for using musket fire as a metaphor, then you kind of also have to accept that using metaphor in burn it the flip down with the truth crosses the same moral boundary. But if you want to play the language is violence game, and the problem with language is violence game is that you empower yourself based on people's words and as bad a faith interpretation as you possibly can make, you empower and enable yourself to retaliate with actual real life tangible consequences for something that is perhaps metaphorical. And when you want to do it for your side, that's great. Just be careful when other people want to do it for their side, because when you play with certain games, you get certain consequences.
Well, one of the things to go with that, and it goes all the way back to the start of this discussion, is like those things get into endless back and forth of Hatfield McCoy's who said the thing first, or who did the thing first. These guys themselves, even later, talk about how the concept of the church being so dangerous to LGBT people is going to cause some sort of stochastic terrorism. I don't know if that was in this podcast or another. I listened to 3 or 4 podcasts around this podcast, and they make the same exact argument, saying, "Oh, somebody's going to go off and go shoot somebody or shoot up a church because you guys are making this so intense." So they'll use the same argument, but the flip end of that. Oh, I'm losing my train of thought.
Well, we've restated what their position is. I think we both agree and can find some agreement on the idea that you do want to let metaphor be metaphor, and don't restrict. Don't say that metaphor can't be metaphor. In terms of lessons learned.
I remembered the point I was going to make, that in the Equality Utah response to this, they use the word crusade. They should already know. I mean, they say in that very thing, words matter, but there's been a lot of baggage in history with people getting in trouble for using the word crusade. And that's the sort of back and forth that can go on eternally with this sorts of stuff. But in acknowledging agreements, definitely people can purposefully, and we know that it happens somewhat here. Some people said, "Ooh, they hear that word muskets and they're, oh, got them," and that's for sure kind of the area. Whereas some other people, I absolutely believe, think that they believe that means that there's going to be somebody getting kind of crazy, and it's back to the same things, like you can't know like the truth of a reaction in somebody's heart all the way. But I absolutely believe that some people saw that as an opportunity to jump on something. And to go.
Any lessons learned?
That there.
I learned that Cardin can dance in his chair pretty nicely. I'm not gonna clip you out of context, Cardin, but I'm gonna clip that chair dance because that was good.
There's muskets in Hamilton. I think that one was kind of, I think the people using it nefariously or not, I think it was kind of, everybody knew it was a metaphor, and the concept is it okay to use a metaphor like that or not? I would say the thing that I learned from them is it was shocking to me to hear them suggest the concepts of diversity readers for their boomer. Like once again, it's shocking to find out that these guys might have the position of, gosh, I wish you guys would, that kind of critical view of their leadership that you think doesn't happen in Mormonism. These guys definitely have critical views of their leadership. That's the lesson learned for me.
Okay, so by way of response to this point of it was a metaphor, get over it. It's just a metaphor. We all use metaphors. Yes, it was a metaphor, and it would be, it wouldn't be good for us to assume that the metaphor is literal and act on it. Certainly wouldn't be assumed, and I don't think that the church leaders imposed that or implied or intend that. And it's also important to be careful about the way that you use metaphor and to understand the position that you have as someone who sets the tone for the culture of the church as a leader. And that you're talking to faculty who have diverse opinions and views. And so you want to be careful about the metaphor. And when you use a metaphor, you're always using a metaphor knowing that you have a variety of metaphors that you can use. And I think it is not unimaginable that there were different metaphors that could be employed that would have been able to promote a spirit of unity and love without the divisive element that a metaphor injects into the conversation.
Yeah, I would respond saying that for sure people like Holland and all that should know that would be a pitfall nowadays. But the strange thing is, I think that response is in line with these guys' response somewhat. They're for sure saying, don't do the metaphor, but I think they also would agree that, come on, Holland, that stuff's going to get blown up, and make our lives harder. Yeah. So the point where I would say that I would point a finger at these guys is, you do it too. You also bring up these, you guys are going to cause an outside threat that's going to cause somebody's going to come shoot us up because of the things you guys say about us and all that sort of stuff. You guys also appeal to that. You do that.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go on to the next one here, which is
because the reality is
this one is actually pretty interesting. All right, this one's called critical radicalization. So.
Yes. Because, the reality is the same people I'm seeing post about, hey, Elder Holland said go point a musket at gay people, and he didn't. But those people saying that, they're also saying, well, also Joseph Smith was a polygamist, and your church banned black people, and you guys did this. You've done so many bad things. Most of those people don't believe the church is true anyway. If we were tomorrow, if the prophet said, okay, we're going to fundamentally, everyone mail back your scriptures. We're going to rip out these pages from the New Testament and from the Doctrine and Covenants, and we're going to change the doctrine completely of the church and change the scriptures of the church and to make it gay marriage inclusive. Okay, if that happened tomorrow, that would not fix anything, because then you still have the issue of, okay, well, every single thing Brigham Young said about race, that needs to be taken off the record too. So we'd have to go and cleanse our church history of things, right? And then after that, what? Okay, well, Joseph Smith and his wives. Okay, well, now every descendant of Joseph Smith, let's give money to because of the pain of his wife. Like, you can't appease the people who ultimately don't want the church to exist. And here's where it gets scary. If you start defining an entire people by their most controversial or worst traits, you dehumanize them. And what follows is you start putting people in camps. People think that's hyperbolic. I'm not being hyperbolic. We've seen that happen throughout history countless times. I'm saying that there is such a growing amount of resentment towards Mormons in Utah. It's terrifying because they're using language like, look what they did to you. They lied to you about their history. They lied to you about your sexuality. They lied to you about chastity. They ruined your life. They manipulated you. They lied to you. They're trying to hurt you. And then they want your friends to kill themselves. They want your friends to kill themselves. They want you to kill yourself. Remember that time you're really, really depressed? That was the church's fault. What are you going to do about it? How much more of this crazy media push of Mormons are bad, and they want to harm you, will it take before somebody takes a gun to BYU campus or a chapel or a temple? We've seen things like this happen throughout history over and over. And I can't help but be terrified when I see these Dylan types and these Mike Norton types and these Nuance Ho types and all these anti-Mormon social media profiles who want nothing but to make people angry and upset at the church. And all it takes is one person jacked up on some serotonin reuptake inhibitors to do something bad. And so by that time, it's going to say, well, who has the musket now? And so we need to understand that, yes, let's be nice to gay people. Let's not have anyone take away their constitutional rights. And let's make sure all of our friends and family are still invited to Thanksgiving dinner. And we're still kind and we can still hang out, or we can still have a good time like I have with all my gay friends right now, when I can invite my friend Henry, who is gay as a rainbow, to come a hot tub with the boys. You know what I'm saying? In our apartment hot tub, and everything is chill, and all those guys have the priesthood and nobody cares. It's a pretty good society. But when it comes to them saying, Henry, you cannot talk to those people because they hate you and your friends should shun them. And guess what? The church is evil. That means we're going to have major issues in the satanic anti-Mormon social media profile people who want violence, who want bad things. They want there to be division, and they are counting on standing on the graves of LGBT people for that division to happen.
And Jen,
I keep spoiling your points.
No, that was a powerfully argued case from Kwaku there.
Yeah, I spoiled. I forget because I saw the 3 different podcasts from them around the same subject, and I forget which one is which, and I didn't know you had that clipped. I spoiled your point. You got to it.
No, that's okay. What are they saying here? I called it, these titles are titles I gave to them, what kind of summarizing what I think. They're talking about critical radicalization is what I said. What are they describing?
They are, I'll say it as succinctly as I'll think I can say it, because to some level I'll suddenly jump to 2, agreed with this concept, is that the church has nowhere to go but year 0, to use that reference. You know, there's no, when it really gets down to breaking down their entire past and all that sort of stuff, hitting back at that Atlantic article, if you like really read it, where the guy's almost kind of begging, like, please don't take everything away from us, because we know we have bad stuff in the past, but we still want to be Mormon. But the truth of it is that there is a critical side of the church that will not accept anything except burning it down to nothing and starting it afresh from nothing if it gets started again. And I do think some people want the Mormon church to exist under an entirely baptized paradigm. And then I think there are some other people who just want it to disappear and go away. There's truth to that is on this ex-Mormon side. I've been all along that spectrum in my whole entire ex-Mormon lifetime. But the second part of it is kind of how I ended off the previous part, is saying that they also make the claim that you're going to radicalize people and cause stochastic terrorism and getting into wanting to referee how other people talk or not, because you may cause something nasty and it will be your fault.
Yeah. I want to make sure that I point out that in the prior clip and in this clip, they punctuate both points by saying, as members of the church, what we need to do, regardless of what the leaders have said, what the criticisms are, we need to show love to our LGBT family members and friends. And we need to start with that, regardless of what else is going, so that the evidence of the love that we have and the connection that we have with people where the rubber hits the road will stand in defiance of any criticism that we may have about what the things that the leaders of the church may say are. And I think starting from that perspective is a great way for individual members of the church to start. And it's a way that will empower them to hold their own in terms of love in their personal relationships, that's not dictated by what some staunch conservative may interpret the words of the brethren to be. So I want to give them credit for that. Beyond that, the idea that you can get into a mindset where you are simply tearing things down finding things that are wrong, pointing out problems, and that becomes the entire goal. The entire nature of your relationship with that thing and with anything connected to that thing is to tear it down, to the exclusion of acknowledging anything positive or acknowledging the human element that exists in it, is a way that it's almost an ideology that can capture your mind and start to color every interaction that you have with anything even remotely connected to it. And you can find those thoughts start to insert into your mind that you need to criticize this and you need to criticize that. And some of that ideology comes with the idea that if you don't speak up and criticize, then you are complicit in whatever harm it does. And all of these ideas swirling around in the mind of someone who is trying to be good and trying to do good and seeing that and has come to equate doing and being good with being critical, it can turn you into a person that does do exactly what they say, and that is that you dehumanize the people involved in this. Just as much as we in the ex-Mormon community don't want people in the church to dehumanize us, and I hate to say it, but Quake, you lose a little bit of points by saying satanic ex-Mormons because that hurt me. But you don't want, as ex-Mormons.
Are you frozen? Or is it me? Oh, goodness.
But I think that's one of their points, is that if you start using this critical mindset to only tear down, to not acknowledge any positive or good, and to equate the people with all of the bad, then you have the potential to go down a radical mindset that will lead you to doing things that otherwise you may not do, because that is the pattern of history. And they're right. We do have, human history is peppered with all forms of radicalization that is built on this idea of doing good that leads you to betray your principles in the name of good. And so for me, that's kind of the gist of this part of their argument.
Yeah, and I would go right into the agreements with that, and at some sort of levels. One of the things I've gotten into arguments with ex-Mormons over the years is that just because you left Mormonism doesn't mean like you got rid of your purity spiraling. It doesn't mean you've gotten rid of your scrupulosity. It doesn't mean that you've gotten rid of. In fact, in some sorts of ways, I sometimes think ex-Mormonism is we had such perfection standards that when we found out the church wasn't exactly perfect, that's what made us dislike it, but then we so it's almost in a weird way, and there's a lot of philosophical concepts through history that talks about that, but it was Mormonism that taught us to be ex-Mormons. And in a lot of different ways, ex-Mormonism is a version of it's Mormonism 2.0, and we turn back to the church and demand it, or the people in it, to get perfect, almost to the level of the Dana Carvey church lady, marching around going like barking. Yeah, exactly. Barking at people, and of course any one of those criticisms is real and true and can be things that people need to get better, but there's also a little bit going away from the law of charity or acceptance or understanding that people need time with things or other sorts of concepts like that. But I would agree with them, and like I said, I see in the future and have seen for a while that as the society kind of gets more and more like that, of turning towards institutions and saying, were you a perfect institution all along? If not, you got to go. And it's really that moment is I sometimes think it's maybe money. Yeah, it's upon us, but there's some sort of levels, probably some sort of money or connections in Mormonism that keeps it always a little bit at bay. But one of the things Holland is addressing is he knows it's right around the corner. It's here. It's going to affect our accreditation or not. It's going to affect if our football teams can play their football teams or not. And at some moment, very soon, we're really going to have to say, are you completely baptizing and erasing your entire, getting rid of the 4 olds of your past? Or are you going to hold on to that, and we're going to have I don't know if it's just parting ways, because I don't know if in this society it's how it's going to be allowed to just part ways. There's going to be constant pressure, and they know it. And these guys' complaints with the boomers a little bit is that they've been slow to recognize it. They mentioned that in this situation, but somewhat of that top general authority, old people are kind of seem to be a little bit unaware, and they're just now starting to become aware of. And that's a straw man a bit, because they have been somewhat aware, but as aware as these guys want it to be, no, they haven't been.
Yeah. There's something to, I always bristle when I hear people say, well, ex-Mormons are just Mormons, and there's just Mormonism 2.0. I hate it. Yeah, I know you said it, but I hate it. But what I want to hear is that, there are aspects of Mormonism, the black and white thinking, the purity culture, the us versus them. Those are all things that were part of the air that we breathed in Mormonism. And as you come out of Mormonism, yes, some of it is educating you as to why the claims of Mormonism were false from a tangible perspective, but also why some of the socially maladaptive ideas and habits that we got into as Mormons don't simply go away. And if we apply them outside of the church, they can lead us into some very unhealthy and dangerous pathways. So the paradigm that I kind of I think that they would agree with their point here is that, we look at the Puritans and all the stuff that happened around things like the Salem witch trials, and there's these social forces that us as humans can fall into, where we are easy to point the finger and to call out the impure and the unrighteous and divide our society that way. And when we are doing it informed by religious moral principles, then we can always point to those moral principles which we can say people are in violation of, and condemn people, dehumanize them, cast them out, put the scarlet A, whatever it is. When you step away from religion, if you still have that circuitry in place, then you just have to substitute the Bible or the religious teaching for some other moral code. And there are plenty of moral codes that don't even talk about religion, that same circuitry can then enact in, and you can have the same divisiveness, the same black and white thinking, the same dehumanization that's informed by a form of secular moral puritanism that is informed by different ways of being critical of things, that will have the same effect of dividing communities and turning your families against each other, and the same sort of things that we see when it's in its worst form in religious settings. The danger, though, is in a religious setting, maybe it's just this little enclave, this little religious group there, but just imagine that happening on your entire society as a whole. We've gone through chapters in our history when you had the McCarthy trials. I mean, you can look at French Revolution, the Great Terror, and Robespierre. You can see where these secular religious or secular moral puritanical forces take hold of a society, and it's never good. And their allusion to blood in the streets and putting people in cages, that is what usually happens at the end of these processes, if they are allowed to continue to cycle and cycle. If everybody interprets in bad faith and assumes bad motive and dehumanizes people, that's kind of where it goes. And so, I may not agree with every point that they're making, but I can agree with there's some forces at play here that as a society we need to be wary of. And the antidote to that is allowing people to be wrong and allowing to live and let live, and assuming charity and not dehumanizing and not doing, and you have to go out of your way to work against these social currents that tend to take over the minds of people involved in these processes. That's my rant for that one. Okay.
Nice.
So my headphone, if my headphones, I'm getting the battery low thing on it. If they burp out, then we may just have to break this into two. But okay, so for me, that was lessons learned. Okay, anything on respectfully respond for this one? Anything that we would disagree with the points that they make? Because they talked about radicalization.
Yeah, I think I disagreed with that one before the clip, just in the sense of you're pulling kind of the same crap sometimes.
Yeah.
And they should recognize that if they want to be intellectually honest, as they kept dropping in their podcast.
There's a reflex when you're fighting against people who are trying to control your language, where you may, in trying to push back against that, end up becoming the beast that you're trying to fight against. Yep. And that can happen a little bit.
Yeah, the old Nietzsche thing, when beware when fighting with monsters, that you don't yourself become a monster. And that's been a huge one for me over the years. And they they're going to not just here, all over the place. That's why I kind of have a hard time knowing if you're going to have it pop up next or something, because like they pepper in all over the place doing the exact thing they criticize somewhere. And so that's the respectful response. And I bet you they might be the type of people that they start recognizing that they'll start limiting that. They might be those types of people, but they're doing it here and there.
Yeah, you mentioned how in the past you've been at all these different places, on the burn it, the flip down, to the, I can see some value in it and that it is worthy of reform. And I think going from the more extreme to the more balanced side of things requires some of that reflection, acknowledging that some of the ways that you've responded to in the past were not the best or ideal for moving forward. I've gone through the same process myself, and I'm hopeful that it's reflected in the way that I cover subjects on the channel.
Part of why my argument, and I still hold to it a little bit, although not all the way, is that it is somewhat Mormon 2.0, is that the sense of, if people kind of don't grasp these principles or whatever, like say if you just erased the actual Mormon church out of the middle of this, and we just had an entire drove of all those people who act and think in maybe in certain black and white ways or whatever, suddenly come to a side where there are paradigms getting put in place to kind of meld your politics into your religion at the same time. But like part of me is like there was a time frame where I was like, just burn all the religions down. I was completely an anti-theist. Now I'm at a point like maybe that's a last thing holding off people turning all their politics into all their religion. And some people will say, well, religion is politics, but to me, somewhat, it plays a little bit of like, how like they say sports plays the role of playing out war without doing war, religion is somewhat kind of maybe like the last whole thing that's like, you're going to separate it out over there so we don't, and so if we just completely remove that dam, I have a bit of a premonition, not that I know for sure what happens, although Nietzsche claimed it would go that way, that
it becomes pure power at that point.
If you just take this thing right away, and I agree, like Mormonism is strange in the sense that you have to, even the Mormons, if they stop and think about it, have to admit that it does kind of liberally change over the years. It changes with pressure, and it's always 20 years behind, but it changes, and it constantly changes. And
we have a video clip of Holland, Elder Holland himself, admitting this.
Yeah, and so my kind of concept is like maybe some of those things can continue changing inside of the church, maybe not. But if you just ripped it all away, I think you'd have a real big problem of exactly what you were saying, of people who are suddenly very prone to take up something else as a religion in a way that could be far more dangerous.
Yeah, I don't want to do away with freedom of religion or with religions. I see them as a canary in the coal mine of freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of belief, and freedom of association. And as long as some crazy whacked out religions are free to meet and believe and act on their convictions, then I feel comfortable in acting on my own convictions, with the caveat of you're not hurting people. And that's where, there's progress being made in religions, acknowledging and changing the harmful and toxic aspects of it. We're not out of the woods on that, but progress is being made. So I'm happy to participate in the discourse around that process of helping those things happen. But I don't want it to be abolished by any stretch of the imagination. And I think that there's value in aspects of religion that maybe we haven't yet worked out and been able to articulate as well, and values to the extent that finding a way to replicate it in a non-religious setting may actually be healthy and good. And so, like, I could give you an example of that. There was a tradition that I grew up with, and I'm sure many Mormon households grew up with, which is your father laying his hands on your head and giving you a blessing before the school year. And when you leave the church, you realize that all the priesthood authority, all the whatever, it's all made up, all the whole paradigm. When you no longer give credibility or validity to that, then it loses its magic. And it's just, or does it? What is it? What does that represent? if you come to see that your father doing that was allowing himself in some weird, crazy paradigm to be vulnerable and connect with you emotionally and tell you the deepest wishes of his heart for you to achieve your potential, and in a way communicate that he was there for you and wanting to be part of that process in a positive way. And again, this is, I know there's toxic family dynamics and there's all kinds of, them imposing their will on you, but just erase all of that and say, what are the good parts of it that we can actually extract from it? What if you were to take a similar ritual and apply it in a non-religious paradigm where, rather than putting your hands on their head as some sort of, top-down thing, just sit in front of them and look at them and take them by the hands so that you have that physical connection, and do the same thing. Allow that same thing that we used to call the Holy Ghost, that was just you giving voice to the feelings in your heart, so that your kid knows that you are there for them, for that you love them, that all of your hopes and dreams are behind them, that you want to be the wind behind their sail. And there's something that exists in that ritual, independent of priesthood authority, independent of all of that, that serves a purpose within a family to increase love, to increase unity, to increase a sense of belonging among the people of the family, if it's done without invoking all of this authority and imposing somebody else's perspective on it. Because that is something that I spent a lot of time thinking about, and for the first time tried to implement this year in my own family. And
that's awesome.
It was just, as a father who identifies a great deal with my role as a father, I realized that there was this thing that I was missing. And it wasn't the priesthood, it wasn't anything. It was just having this ritual with my family it was just a regular way for me to stamp on my family the sense of love and unity and support, that for whatever its failings in the rest of the church, somehow that beautiful thing ended up in the church. And yes, I know, and all the caveats, it can be used in manipulative and terrible ways, but when you're out of the church, you get to create these types of rituals and traditions. When you look back in the church and you say, what was it that worked? What was it that was good about it? Can I capture any of that on my own and find the beautiful parts of it? And when you start to go through this exercise regularly, it takes away, it's harder to dehumanize and demonize people who are in the church or aspects of the church that have evolved and been supportive of the people who inhabit that space. And so that's where I think the more that you do that, the less easy it is to fall into that burn it, the flip down. And the more you want to say, well, reform, improvement, progression is a pathway for the church that can have some positive benefits. It's going to require that we allow dissenting voices to talk. And I think Kwaku and Cardin and Brad are pioneering a way of having a dissenting voice that still follows under the umbrella of progress. And certainly there's a lot of stuff I don't like about the way that they do it, but they're doing something here that you're not seeing a lot of different segments of apologists doing. Fair Mormon's not doing this. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I know there's something with them, with some other people in the ex-Mormon community, where it gets to like levels of drama. Sometimes I think the drama might come up in a way to avoid having the better conversations, like that, because in the ultimate end of stuff, both sides, when they're having a good conversation, are going to have to come to some dialectic. That means both sides budge a little bit, But I 100% agree with what you said. And I think I always kind of think about this. Maybe there's something like Freudian to it, because everybody kind of like thinks of like maybe your experience with your father is how you perceive a church and that sort of stuff. My dad is a stake patriarch, and he is, I think anybody who's ever interacted with him or known him has known he's just the most guileless person on earth, and just completely sweet and completely nice and completely genuine and sincere. And I don't sneer at those patriarchal blessings in the slightest when people come over and do it and all that sorts of stuff. And you say that the church can continue changing and all that sorts of stuff too, but I can also say that pretty straightforward that I'm not in it. I'm not a part of it, and I'm not going to be a part of it, but they can continue changing, and I hope they continue changing. There's part of me that feels that they have to change on their own terms, you can talk with them and let them change. But just like, anybody who's going into ex-Mormonism, you can't march them into it. You have to kind of let them get to it. But maybe the only way that sort of thing can happen is with conversation and that sort of stuff. But because of my experiences with parents who were very, very, very nice and good, I just don't, that plays into how I just view it as there's good intentioned people in that stuff. And I myself I left, as I said years ago, on empirical terms. I left because it just didn't add up. And I was really frustrated back then that people couldn't understand that I just didn't see the truth claims as being good, and other than that, I never was offended. I never had problems with anybody. I never this or that. I've continued and stuff. You say my continued Mormonism. I mean, I'm a physique competitor, all these different stuff that comes from, like, I have certain standards or abilities to withhold that comes from Mormonism. I mean, it for sure can't, like, I know that some of my abilities to do whacked out diets comes from Mormonism, even to a scrupulosity level. But like, it's I still hold on to stuff. I still do certain things to become the best me. And sometimes a criticism myself, I sometimes get a little frustrated with the LGBT people on the certain sense of, like, saying you can leave, like, you can just drop it, like, you can let them. I mean, I agree that, like, we can always look back and comment and all that sort of stuff, but really you can let them go, you can leave them behind, and maybe still just kind of respectfully agree to disagree. I understand that's different when you're still a dependent and still living under a household and all that sorts of stuff. But at some level you can, and I know some of those people still want the religious aspect or that sort of end of it, but I'm always kind of the belief of you can make your own religion in that sort of sense. But just like we're talking about here, if maybe they did go back and try to have these types of conversations, if they could get into them with the Mormon community, I think it'd go a lot farther to change stuff over time, rather than the super internety attacks that these guys also participate in. I mean, I think everybody has, because we're all learning how to do social media in the past 10 years. And
it's a good Smackdown feels so good. Yeah. You just want to do it. You're like, yeah, and you get all the likes and the reposts, and you're like, I got them good.
You did the hitch.
Okay, so let's do one more, and then I think my batteries are gonna die, and it's probably longer than it should have been anyway, but that's how it goes. All right, so let's hit it up here. All right, this one's called, hold on, let's choose a good one, because I don't know if this one is probably redefined word and manipulation. Outsiders. Okay. All right, this one. There's some good ones here. Okay, let's look at this one. This one's gonna be tough.
Talks about the toxic relationship that's developed from wokeism. I have had women in my ward crying, asking me to reach out through social media to their own children and grandchildren who have sent them text messages saying, until you will renounce the church to me, or will renounce X political leader to me, or will announce this and that publicly, I'm not coming to Thanksgiving. In fact, I don't want to be around you.
I saw this horrific TikTok that made me sick, of this woman crying. By the way, filming her dad, saying, basically telling her dad to renounce God. She was ex-Mormon. She's saying, you need to, like, renounce God if you love me. And he's like, I can't do that. And she says, so you can't love me without God? He says, no, because true love is godly. I can't love you without God. And she starts crying. And these are fake tears. She's recording her father. He was an elderly dude at this point, trying to manipulate an old man on camera to score some ex-Mormon points. Like, I've seen the most evil people I've ever met in the ex-Mormon community. And this is why you want to know, okay, what the video that just went viral of the kid pouring the water on the right south of BYU campus on the stairs next to brick oven going up. They had a rainbow Y painted, not painted, a chalked on, right? Guy comes up with water or something, pouring it on.
Before we get to that, because they're moving to a different point there, but they brought up this point of the TikTok of the woman talking to her dad. Have you seen that TikTok?
Yeah. I think I forwarded it to you. Do you have a?
Yeah, I'm tempted to show it, but I don't want to.
Explode.
I don't know. I don't think it needs to be exploiting. It's a difficult one to watch.
Wrong word. Yeah.
In some cases because of some of the things that they're talking about here, but I think there's a perspective on the other side that is missing from their analysis of it. But let's see if we were going to restate their point on this. What would it be here? Because
a lot of ex-Mormonism is really, really harsh and really has the intent of changing by force the church, and changing by force some level of force their parents or how parents think. And
yeah, he's talking about leveraging relationships, where you make it's weird. He's saying that some people as ex-Mormons are going to their family members who still believe in the church and saying, unless you either renounce the church or say that you support me in XYZ principle, then you don't love me and I don't want to have anything to do with you, or we can't be family or something like that. It's basically tying a relationship to saying you have to believe or say certain things. And they're characterizing this as manipulative and abusive, and something that seems to be affecting a lot of people, even in their circle among believing people. Cardin mentions that mothers and parents in their ward have children who are essentially cutting them out of their lives on an ideological basis. If you don't believe in these ideas or support these things or reject these things, then you're out.
Yeah.
And then they provide a physical, tangible example that you could go and Google and find.
It was hard to find. It wasn't very easy.
Okay. Well, I hesitate to show it, but essentially it is a crying ex-Mormon, or at least it's tagged ex-Mormon, and they're holding up their phone and emotionally making an appeal to their parent for them to love them outside of the church. And you're only hearing one side of the argument and only one particular snap point. It's not clear whether the other parent understands that they're being recorded and broadcast to the entire ex-Mormon community. And there's this accusation that will constantly be leveraged towards people who post things online that they are performative. Have you heard that before? This is a performative thing. What does that mean?
Yeah, definitely. They're searching for a certain reaction to get views and points, and I mean, I guess that plays up. I mean, TikTok is coming up. It's coming up a lot in the world. You hear that it brought up a lot by the Lynn and Nuance host, saying it's the place. It's kind of the frontier of ex-Mormonism right now, and people in that realm get kind of fast, big clicks, and it's gotten to a point where I have some other very Mormon friends who say their kids are seeing it all, and it is kind of marching out there pretty well and being seen by a lot of people from just kind of small little things. And so you get something that's kind of a very inflammatory like that, and boom, it blows up. And
not only that, but he talked before about critical radicalization, and there's a form of radicalization that leads to this leveraging of family relationships on the point of ideology, where you have to believe or say some things, or we're going to not have a family relationship. That type of, you get to that point where you're willing to sacrifice family relationships on differences of belief through a system of progressive radicalization. And we all would say, oh, Scientologists, they radicalize their people. They have to go through like 2 hours of indoctrination every day. And you can listen to like Chris Shelton and the Scientologists, and they talk about being in the Sea Org, and they have to study for, 2 or 3 hours out of every day in between all the stuff that they're doing. And that sounds like terrible indoctrination, but there are people who TikTok for 9 hours a day, just swiping. And there are things on TikTok outside of even the realm of religion that have the effect of indoctrination. and change people's mind and worldview, give people a different set of rules by which to see the world and to see themselves, in the point that their identity becomes enmeshed with a new ideology that is based on dogmatic ideas that they don't even know that they can't question, because they've just been flooded with these ideas and this constant stream that gets, infused with the whole like and share elements that give you a sense of their importance. And so that phenomenon exists out there. And I think that they're saying that ex-Mormonism is affecting the minds and lives of people in Mormonism to the point that they are getting indoctrinated by social media, and they're pointing to people that they demonize in social media. They didn't name me the whole time, so I'm a little bit disappointed, but that's okay. They named Nuance Ho, and they named several others.
But those are all people who have been dramatic with them, like said some sort of ad hominem or amplified attack on them. Yeah. There's definitely that world going on. I follow a lot of the ex-Mormon TikToks, and some of them I find perfectly interesting, and some of them I do like, kind of look at sideways. It's like, what are you guys doing? And there's actually even some different interesting apologists and the morphing of the Mormon apologists happening on there as well, which is part of one of the things that you said, maybe we haven't gotten into yet, the same way these guys are morphing the way they do that. But there for sure is a critical paradigm that people are learning. One of the hashtags they use on TikTok, ex-Mormonism, is hashtag deconstruction, and then they'll talk about, I'm doing my deconstruction process, and almost kind of sounds like I'm doing my testimony building process, but the opposite. And I mean, I have a different view of what the word deconstruction means. I mean, there's a couple different views of what that means from like the critical world, but there's definitely people using it as kind of a process or a paradigm that they're using inside of TikTok, that I'm sure that they don't exactly know the whole backstory of what deconstruction is, but it does kind of play along into like certain ideologies are cropping up that they themselves are also ideologies.
Yeah. Getting back to this video about the mom, the daughter and the dad, the conversation goes something along the lines of, can you love me without the church or without God? And the dad, he hesitates a little bit. He's like, no. And that really triggers an intense emotional response from the person. And you can watch that video, and as an ex-Mormon, it will be very easy to listen to the person who's in pain, hear that response from their dad, and empathize immediately with that sense of pain, because there's this fear that we all have that our differences on our beliefs regarding the church will lead to rejection by our family, because we know how closely they identify with the church, to the point in some instances of prioritizing it over family. And you can pick out those verses from the teachings of the leaders that would support that perspective. I had that fear a lot. I went for a period of time where I was like, I'm just never going to tell my mom that I think or believe differently. I'm going to wait till she passes, and then I can actually live my life. And after a while, I just couldn't do that. And I trusted her to treat me with love. And I went to her with the way that I believe about things. And there's been rocky times, but we built a relationship there. And there's, in the early phases of going through this faith crisis process, you're going to feel a lot of that pain. And it's going to make you almost feel like your family members are captured by this ideology, and that they are completely brainwashed drones of this heartless church that only cares about tithing and obedience. And that's one way to interpret it. And so I want to validate that is how ex-Mormons would see that video. And you instantly want to empathize with the woman and feel terrible for her situation. And I want to step back from that perspective and say, there's a general principle anytime you're talking with people who have different views, particularly religious views. And that principle is that each of us carry a set of ideas that shapes who we are, the world around us, and our place in it, and our identity. And so I have a worldview that is my own, and some of it is built on ideas that are provable and testable, and others built on ideas that are maybe less tangible, and maybe even things that I don't even know that I accept them. And other people will have that as well. If I want to connect with them, I can't demand that somebody else immediately take on the worldview that I have. I want my worldview to be respected, and so I have to connect with other people to some extent where our worldviews meet, understanding that we cannot impose. I don't want them to impose it on me, and I can't impose it on them. So if I understand that these boundaries have to exist, they are going to think and believe the way that they want to. I can be persuasive. Ultimately, if they're going to change, they have to move. But at the same time, I am going to hold on to my worldview. And if I'm going to do that and respect it, then what I can do is try to, with charity, get what I can out of that relationship in a way that respects that. And so if I'm talking to my father or my mother and I say, "Can't you love me?" And they say, "Yes, I can love you, but can't you love me without God?" And they say, "Well, no, I can't love you without God." I can extend charity to them and say, okay, well, if I were to put myself in their shoes, they may hold the conviction that God is love, and anywhere love is, there God is also. So they may actually equate the notion of love with God. So from where they sit, they cannot deny that they love me, but love is sort of God to them. And so for them, their love for me is an expression of some godly force in their life. And so if they tell me that they can love me, or they can't love me without God, I can extend charity and say from their worldview, from where they sit, even though it's different from mine, I can still feel the warmth of their love, even if it's fueled by something that I don't understand. And that's a starting point. And you have to have other conversations about, certain ways that you can accept and love people as whole individuals, but that's at least a starting point. And losing the ability to see that we all have an ideology built by, in some cases, dogma, which hopefully it's not dogma and it's things we can challenge and test. In some cases it is dogma. And that we can at least acknowledge that's there. That's where, people in postmodernism talk about everything's a social construct or whatever. There are things that are social constructs that are going to exist no matter what. It's just some of them are backed by reality and some of them aren't, but we all have them. And in some cases we never test them, so we don't know if they're backed by reality. But if you just start with that point, knowing that everybody has it, and then just kind of meet them where they're at, then you're starting the first step of that reciprocity that is going to allow them to meet you where you're at. And change may happen, but it's going to happen through the matrix of mutual respect and understanding and acknowledgement. It's okay for you to be where you are right now. I don't have to change you. And there's a degree of emotional maturity that comes from within, where you're willing to say, you know what? Even if your family cuts you off, like, therapists aren't training you to find every injury that's coming to you, blow it as big as it can be, and then be as hurt as possible for as long as possible. Their therapists, using cognitive behavioral therapy and other paradigms, are teaching you to put things in perspective, to be resilient, to not let those things take over your life, and show strength in the face of the type of adversity that these things represent. And that's the kind of modeling that, to promote a healthy community, you want to model that type of response here. And so that is where I think I can understand where Kwaku and Cardin would look at a video like that, a TikTok like that, and they would say, this is somebody who's giving a bad faith interpretation. They're trying to leverage their relationship. They're trying to force the grandpa to think the way that they think. And then they're using love as a leverage for all of it. And so they're going to be critical of it. And the thing is, I can see their point of view. I also see the point of view of the pain and the hurt that it feels in the moment when you're at that time, because we all get damaged at a point, and we still have to try to interact with our loved one at that damaged point. We're just praying that the mature adults in the room have thought through this enough to extend that to us at that moment in time. Anyway, that's my rant on that one.
You're referencing Greg Lukianoff there, and Haidt, the Coddling of the American Mind, Jonathan Haidt's book.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's an excellent book.
Yeah, it's top notch, and I 100% agree that certain paradigms nowadays kind of preach the opposite of what cognitive behavioral therapy would suggest that you do. That TikTok video, I think you can kind of sense it if you really watch it. She asks the father, "Do you love me?" And I think he initially says yes, and then changes his answer to no, because then he reframes it as within the framework of God's love. That's not technically love. I think he was making a semantic argument about theology, and she was possibly using it to show, look how terrible my parents are, or look how terrible Mormonism made my parents, which is frequently kind of the added level that side wants to. But and
on the note of none of us wanting our worst moments to be memorialized for eternity, when you're having conversations like this, these really difficult conversations where you may have people you love act on a moment in time where they are in relation to the ideology of the faith, that maybe that you want them to be able to feel like they can change in the future and not lose space, don't broadcast it to the internet. Let those private moments be private, and characterize your future dealings with charity and forgiveness and grace, because those principles of forgiveness and grace, people in religions have a ready vocabulary for that. It may be misapplied at sometimes, but it's there. They can draw upon it. When you step outside of religion, there is so fewer moments of forgiveness and grace. And those elements are so necessary for a pluralistic society of people that want to get along and not simply be in total chaos fighting all the time.
Yeah. So then what about the next viral video that they mentioned there, though, that because that one has kind of a weird angle to it, that maybe this girl shouldn't be, should be keeping this private, possibly, or not searching for kudos on the back of a bad moment from her father. But what about the bad moment from the actual actor, that kid?
Yeah, this is let's finish it up with this. Let's see.
On there, and people are like, "What are you doing?" He says, "FAGGOTS, go to hell." That's what he says, and walks off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a rookie error.
Yeah,
rookie error.
Bad, right?
It's a little worse than that. Okay. Yeah,
very bad thing.
Well, rookie errors, and like, who does that?
Yeah.
Like, even somebody that believed that unironically would have to be smart enough. Even the most cynical homophobe would be smart enough to not record that on social media. Like, what?
Yeah,
I hear these things. I'm like, I don't know what to say to those people either.
Yeah.
Love your neighbor.
Yeah,
maybe.
It's like,
guys, chill out.
If you're 22 years old and a student at BYU, how in the 22 years of attending the Mormon church have you not figured out the first law is much like the second law?
Yep.
Love thy neighbor as thyself, or love God with all thy heart. And the second one,
as somebody who grew up with an iPhone, how do you know not to use a slur on camera? You're like, what are you dumb? So anyway.
I gotta say that I enjoy the banter and the camaraderie among these three. They have a sense of humor that I enjoy watching as well, and they're not all the same. So you get like the boisterous, loud one that's a little bit like Alex Jones, and then you get Kwaku, and he's totally smooth. Like, you'll notice in the thumbnail for this one, I was like scanning through. I'm like, I need to find the ugliest, when their face is just like this, the ugliest picture, and I couldn't, because they're just all such dapper guys, and they're smiling all the time, and so you can't really take a smiling picture and make it look angry. But
they're smarter and have thought about it way harder than I was already nuanced on this stuff, and they still took me farther. I even had some other kind of preconceived notions about them because of certain internet dramas, and but no, they're actually trying to think stuff through and actually making arguments and actually trying to be honest. Where somebody does something that's just completely indefensible, they're not going to try to defend it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think we just agree with all the stuff here. That probably points you could make about the whole. There's an element of like, the point is not whether or not it was on camera; it was whether or not it was said in the first place. that would just, you know, if we want to just agree, lessons learned, whatever, just get to the response part of that, given that we agree with all the other aspects of it. But that's a nice punctuation to an interesting exploration of a video. We'll see what kind of support we get from this. Listen, Chris, I couldn't imagine having been able to get through this in kind of this weird structured way without your thoughtful feedback and your commentary on it. I really appreciate you bringing that to here. I'm hoping that your voice is one that we're going to see more and more, because I think you have a lot of really good perspectives and a good background to bring to the discourse around a lot of these different issues that we're confronting that is a perspective you don't really hear in the ex-Mormon community a lot. So thank you so much for showing up and giving us a little bit of your mind.
No, thank you, and thanks for having me, and thanks for listening to me. That's one of the issues with the ex-Mormon community. Maybe Jonathan Streeter is one of the only ones who's ready to hear from anybody, but that's a huge kudos to you, and I love your videos, and I love your way to like kind of take it from a journalistic point whenever you're covering anything, and keep the emotions happy and good, and covering the stuff, and then not being afraid to say any criticism that you feel you need to say, and then it's pretty amazing.
I appreciate it. All right. Well, normally I would go into taking calls, but my headset was not fully charged, and Yu-Gi-Oh has decided he's going to bark up a storm and demand attention, and he's probably laid some Tootsie Rolls over there. So with that said, you know, if people want a part 2, then we'll see if they request it. There's a few other things to say, but I think there's some other things that I can bring you back for that we can talk about and have some good discussion on. So until next time, then, this has been Talk on Things and Stuff. Take care.